in the lawless frontier town of Dry Creek, where justice bows to gold and corruption wears a badge, one woman dared to speak the truth, and it nearly cost her everything. When Elena Marlowe faced the executioner's whip for defying the most powerful man in 3 territories, death seemed certain. But fate had other plans. A Comanche warrior named Cale Ironhorse would shatter that moment of doom, igniting a chase across the merciless desert that would test every limit of human endurance, trust, and love. This is their story, a tale of betrayal, survival, and 2 souls bound by honor in a world gone mad with greed. Stay with me until the very end of this epic saga, and don't forget to comment below with your city, so I can see how far this incredible story has traveled across our great nation. The sun blazed mercilessly over Dry Creek, Arizona territory on that fateful morning of September 15th, 1887. Heat waves shimmered off the dusty main street like ghostly dancers, and the air itself seemed to crackle with tension. The entire population of the frontier town, all 437 souls, had gathered in the central square, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and barely concealed fear. At the center of it all stood a makeshift platform, hastily constructed from rough-hewn pine boards that still bled sap in the scorching heat. Upon this crude stage, a wooden post rose like an accusatory finger toward the cloudless sky, its surface scarred by countless previous performances of frontier justice. Iron rings had been driven deep into the wood, their metal surfaces polished smooth by the desperate grip of condemned hands. Sheriff Augustus Caldwell, a man whose belly had grown as large as his corruption over the years, stepped forward with a scroll of parchment clutched in his meaty fist. His badge caught the sunlight, but the gleam couldn't hide the tarnish that ran deeper than mere oxidation. Behind him stood 3 deputies, their hands resting on their gun belts, with practiced ease, their eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of trouble. "Citizens of Dry Creek," Caldwell's voice boomed across the square, silencing the murmur of conversations. "We are gathered here this morning to witness justice being served upon one who has violated the sacred trust of our community." A path opened through the crowd, and 2 men emerged, dragging between them a figure that would have commanded attention in any gathering. Elena Marlowe walked with her head held high despite the iron shackles that bound her wrists, her long auburn hair catching fire in the morning light. Her dress, once fine blue cotton, now bore the stains and tears of 3 days in Dry Creek's excuse for a jail cell. But her green eyes, those remarkable eyes that seemed to hold depths of emerald fire, remained unbroken, scanning the crowd with a mixture of defiance and disappointment. "Elena Marlowe," Sheriff Caldwell continued, unrolling his scroll with theatrical flourish, "you stand accused of sedition, disturbing the peace, and inciting rebellion against lawful authority. How do you answer these charges?" Elena's voice carried clearly across the square, steady and unwavering, despite her circumstances. "I answer that truth is not sedition. Sheriff Caldwell, speaking against injustice is not rebellion. It's the duty of every citizen with a conscience." A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. Some nodded in grudging agreement, while others glanced nervously toward the large house on the hill that overlooked the town, the residence of Marcus Barrow, the cattle baron, whose word had become law in Dry Creek and whose influence stretched across 3 territories. "The accused remains unrepentant," Caldwell declared, his voice taking on the tone of a man reading from a script he'd memorized but never believed. "Therefore, by the authority vested in me by the territory of Arizona and upon the sworn testimony of witnesses, I pronounce sentence upon Elena Marlowe 20 lashes with the cat o' 9 tails, to be administered publicly as an example to all who would disturb the peace of our fair community." The crowd stirred uneasily. 20 lashes was a brutal sentence for a woman, possibly fatal. Even in the harsh justice of the frontier, such severity was usually reserved for the most heinous crimes. But everyone knew this wasn't about justice, it was about power, and the message that Marcus Barrow's will would be enforced at any cost. Elena was roughly dragged to the whipping post, her shackles removed only to be immediately replaced by leather restraints that bound her wrists to the iron rings. The executioner, a thick-set man named Dutch Henderson, who performed this grim duty for $1 per lash, tested his whip with a sharp crack that made several women in the crowd flinch and turn away. "Any last words, Elena Marlowe?" Sheriff Caldwell asked, though his tone suggested he hoped she would remain silent. Elena turned her head slightly, addressing not the sheriff, but the crowd that surrounded her. Her voice carried with remarkable clarity, reaching even those standing at the back of the square. "I have spent my life in this territory," she began, her words measured but passionate. "I have seen it grow from a collection of trading posts and mining camps into thriving communities. I have watched good men and women build homes, raise families, and create something worthy from this harsh land. But I have also watched as fear began to replace hope, as corruption crept into the very foundations of our society." "Enough," Caldwell barked, but Elena continued, her voice growing stronger. "3 weeks ago, I stood in the Silver Dollar Saloon and spoke about what many of you see but dare not voice, how Marcus Barrow has systematically destroyed every rancher and farmer who refused to sell their land to him at his price. How his men have terrorized families, burned barns, and poisoned waterholes. How the law in this town serves only one master, and justice is bought and sold like cattle at market." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Many faces showed recognition, even agreement, but also the paralyzing fear that had settled over Dry Creek like a plague. "You all know the truth of what I speak," Elena continued, her voice beginning to crack with emotion, but never losing its strength. "Ask Sarah Mitchell, whose husband was found dead in his own well after refusing to sell. Ask Tom Bradley, whose daughter disappeared the day after he spoke against Barrow at the town meeting. Ask yourselves why 3 different sheriffs have left this town in the past 2 years, each one richer when he departed than when he arrived." "I said enough," Caldwell roared, his face purple with rage and embarrassment. "Henderson, do your duty." Dutch Henderson raised his whip. The 9 leather tails spread like the fingers of death in the desert air. The crowd held its collective breath. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, their usual chatter replaced by an ominous silence. But just as Henderson's arm began its downward arc, a sound unlike any other filled the air, the thunder of hoofbeats approaching at a gallop, accompanied by a war cry that raised the hair on every neck in the square. From the eastern end of town, where the desert met the scattered buildings of Dry Creek's outskirts, a horse and rider emerged like a vision from another world. The horse was magnificent, a coal-black stallion that moved with the fluid power of controlled lightning. Its rider sat with the easy grace of one born to the saddle, his long, dark hair streaming behind him like a battle flag. He wore the traditional clothing of the Comanche buckskin leggings and shirt decorated with intricate beadwork, a bone choker at his throat, and eagle feathers braided into his hair. Across his back was slung a rifle, and at his side hung a war hatchet that caught the sunlight as he rode. But it was his face that commanded attention, strong features carved from bronze with eyes like black coals that seemed to see everything at once. This was Cale Iron Horse Warrior of the Quahati Comanche, and he rode with the purpose of a man who had made a decision from which there would be no retreat. The crowd scattered like startled birds as Cale thundered into the square, his horse's hooves striking sparks from the hard-packed earth. Sheriff Caldwell fumbled for his gun, but his reflexes had been dulled by years of easy corruption and too much whiskey. His deputies were no quicker caught off guard by the sudden appearance of a warrior they had heard described in whispers around campfires but never expected to see in broad daylight in the middle of their town. Cale's horse reared up on its hind legs just feet from the whipping post, its hooves pawing the air like weapons. In one fluid motion, Cale slid from the saddle, his moccasined feet hitting the ground, in perfect silence despite the chaos around him. His dark eyes met Elena's green ones for just a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, and in that brief exchange something passed between them that neither could have explained in words. "What is the meaning of this?" Sheriff Caldwell demanded, finally managing to draw his weapon. "This is a legal proceeding, Indian. You have no authority here." Kyl's response came not in words, but in action. Moving with the fluid speed that had made the Comanche the most feared warriors of the southern plains, he drew his knife and cut through Elena's leather restraints in 2 swift strokes. The crowd gasped as she fell forward, her legs weak from standing so long in the heat, but Kyl caught her with one strong arm. "The woman spoke truth," Kyl said, his English accented but clear, his voice carrying the authority of generations of warriors. "Truth needs no permission." "Shoot him!" Caldwell screamed at his deputies, but his men hesitated. Killing an unarmed woman was one thing done from a distance with the sanction of law, however corrupt. But facing a Comanche warrior in single combat was another matter entirely. Stories of what happened to those who crossed the horse lords of the plains were told around every frontier fire, and few of those stories ended well for the white men involved. During this moment of hesitation, Kyl lifted Elena onto his horse with surprising gentleness, then vaulted into the saddle behind her. His stallion seemed to sense the urgency of the moment, prancing and snorting with barely contained energy. "You're making a mistake, warrior," a new voice called from the edge of the crowd. Marcus Barrow himself had arrived mounted on a fine chestnut gelding and accompanied by 6 of his men. The cattle baron was a man of average height, but imposing presence, with steel-gray hair and eyes like chips of winter ice. His clothes were expensive tailored suit, polished boots, silver-headed walking stick, but he wore them like armor rather than mere clothing. "That woman is a criminal legally sentenced under territorial law." Barrow continued, his voice carrying the absolute confidence of a man accustomed to having his will obeyed. "Take her and you make yourself an enemy of the United States government. The cavalry will hunt you to the ends of the earth." Kyl's response was to pull his rifle from its scabbard with one hand while keeping the other arm protectively around Elena's waist. The Winchester 73 was well maintained and obviously much used, its stock worn smooth by countless hours in his grip. "Your law is no law," Kyl replied, his voice steady despite the 20 guns now pointed in his direction. "Your justice is no justice. The woman goes free. Kill them both." Barrow snarled, but even as the words left his mouth, Kyl's heels touched his horse's flanks, and the magnificent stallion exploded into motion. What followed was a display of horsemanship that would be talked about in Dry Creek for generations. Kyl's stallion wove between the scattered members of the crowd, like water flowing around stones, never once striking a person despite the chaos and confusion. Gunshots rang out behind them, but the shooters were hampered by the presence of their own citizens, and most of the bullets went wild. One shot, however, found its mark. Elena gasped and pressed her hand to her left shoulder, where blood was beginning to seep through her torn dress. But there was no time to stop, no time to assess the wound. Behind them, Barrow's men were mounting their horses, and the thunder of pursuit was already beginning. As they reached the eastern edge of town, Kyl pulled his horse to a momentary halt and looked back at the square where Elena had so nearly met her fate. The crowd was dispersing now, people hurrying back to their homes and businesses, with the quick, guilty steps of those who had witnessed something they wished they could forget. "Why?" Elena asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of approaching hoofbeats. "Why did you risk everything for a stranger?" Kyl's dark eyes met hers again, and this time he held her gaze for several heartbeats before answering. "My grandfather once told me that the measure of a warrior is not in the enemies he defeats, but in the innocent he protects. You spoke for those who could not speak for themselves. That makes you kin to every warrior who ever drew breath." Before Elena could respond, the sound of pursuit grew too close to ignore. Kale urged his horse forward, and they plunged into the vast expanse of desert that stretched beyond Dry Creek like an ocean of sand and stone. Behind them, a dozen riders emerged from the town, their faces grim with purpose and their weapons gleaming in the afternoon sun. The chase had begun. As they rode, Elena found herself pressed against Kael's chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her back. Despite the pain in her shoulder and the terror of their situation, she felt an unexpected sense of safety in his arms. This man, this warrior who had appeared like an answer to an unspoken prayer, radiated a quiet strength that seemed unshakable. "Where are we going?" she asked as they crested a low ridge that gave them a brief view of their pursuers. The dust cloud behind them was growing larger, indicating that more men had joined the chase. "There is a place," Kyle replied, guiding his horse down the far side of the ridge and into a maze of eroded canyons and towering rock formations. "My people have used it for generations when the bluecoats came hunting. It will give us shelter and time to tend your wound." The mention of her injury made Elena suddenly aware of the burning pain in her shoulder and the sticky warmth of blood on her skin. She had been shot before an occupational hazard of frontier life, but never while fleeing for her life across hostile territory. As if sensing her distress, Kyle's arm tightened protectively around her waist. "You are strong," he said quietly. "I can feel it in the way you sit a horse, in the way you faced that crowd without flinching. The bullet passed through cleanly, painful, but not dangerous if we can clean it properly." They rode in silence for several more minutes, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hoofbeats on stone and the whisper of wind through the canyons. The landscape around them was harsh but beautiful red sandstone cliffs, carved into fantastic shapes by millennia of wind and water, sparse vegetation clinging to life in the most unlikely places, and everywhere the sense of vast eternal spaces that dwarfed human concerns. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Kyle guided his horse into a narrow defile between two towering walls of rock. The passage was so narrow that Elena could have reached out and touched either wall without fully extending her arms, and so winding that anyone following would have to proceed single file and slowly. After what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, the passage opened into a hidden canyon, perhaps 100 yards across and twice as long. At its center was a spring of clear water surrounded by cottonwood trees whose leaves whispered secrets in the evening breeze. Ancient pictographs covered the canyon walls, the artwork of peoples whose names had been forgotten but whose spirits seemed to linger in this sacred place. "We are safe here," Kyle said as he dismounted, and then helped Elena down from the horse. "The entrance is too narrow for more than one rider at a time, and there are places where a single man with a rifle could hold off an army." Elena's legs almost buckled as her feet touched the ground, and Kyle caught her arm to steady her. The adrenaline that had sustained her through their escape was beginning to fade, leaving behind exhaustion and the throbbing pain of her wound. "Sit," Kyle commanded gently, guiding her to a flat rock beside the spring. "Let me see the injury." As he examined her shoulder with surprisingly gentle hands, Elena found herself studying his face in the golden light of the setting sun. She had heard stories about the Comanche all her life, tales of savage warriors who showed no mercy to their enemies. But the man tending her wound bore little resemblance to those stories. His touch was careful, professional, and his dark eyes showed only concern for her welfare. "You have medical training," she observed, wincing as he probed the edges of the wound. "My grandmother was a healer," Kale replied, not looking up from his work. "She taught me the ways of medicine as well as war. A warrior who cannot tend wounds is of little use to his people." He moved to his horse and returned with a leather pouch containing various herbs and medicines. With practiced efficiency, he cleaned the wound with water from the spring, applied a poultice made from plants Elena didn't recognize, and bound her shoulder with strips of soft doe skin. "There," he said when he was finished. "The bleeding has stopped, and the medicine will prevent infection. You will be sore for several days, but you will heal." As night fell over the hidden canyon, Cale built a small fire in a depression surrounded by rocks, positioned so that the light would not be visible from outside their sanctuary. He then disappeared into the darkness for nearly an hour, returning with a rabbit he had somehow managed to catch and kill silently. As they shared the simple meal, Elena found herself studying her unlikely rescuer with growing curiosity. Everything about him spoke of competence and quiet strength, but there were mysteries in his dark eyes that she longed to understand. "Why are you alone?" she asked finally. "From what I've heard, Comanche warriors usually travel in bands." Cale was quiet for so long that Elena began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried depths of pain that his stoic expression didn't reveal. "I am the last of my band," he said simply. "The others fell to soldiers' bullets or white man's diseases. I ride alone because there is no one left to ride with." The weight of that statement settled between them like a physical presence. Elena had lost much in her life, her parents to cholera, her husband to a mining accident, her faith in human nature to the corruption she had witnessed in Dry Creek. But to be the sole survivor of one's entire people was a burden she could barely imagine. "I'm sorry," she said softly, the inadequacy of the words apparent even as she spoke them. "Do not be sorry for me," Cale replied, poking at the fire with a stick. "My people live on in me. Their spirits guide my actions. Their wisdom shapes my choices. I am not alone. I carry them all within my heart." They sat in comfortable silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts, as the fire burned down to glowing embers. Above them the stars emerged in all their desert brilliance, unmarred by the smoke and artificial light that dimmed them in more civilized places. "What happens now?" Elena asked as Cale banked the fire for the night. "Now we rest," he replied. "Tomorrow we will face whatever comes. But tonight we are safe. We are alive and we are free. That is enough for now." As Elena settled down to sleep on a bed of soft grass beside the spring, she reflected on the extraordinary turn her life had taken. 24 hours ago she had been a prisoner awaiting what might have been a death sentence. Now she was a fugitive from justice, her fate tied to that of a Comanche warrior she had never met before he saved her life. But as sleep began to claim her, Elena realized that despite everything, the danger, the uncertainty, the pain of her wound, she felt more hopeful than she had in years. For the first time in a long time, she was not facing the future alone. In the distance, barely audible over the whisper of wind through the canyon, came the sound of hoofbeats. Their pursuers were still out there searching through the night. But morning would bring its own challenges, and whatever lay ahead, Elena knew that her life would never be the same. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Cale's silhouette against the stars, standing watch with his rifle in his hands, and the patient stillness of a predator waiting for prey. Tomorrow, the real test would begin. Resayer TS Part 2. Lưu ý viết 8555-9 cho anh ạ. Từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần, duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng, đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ. Phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kẻ theo ngôi thứ ba, giữ độ kịch tính không viết lan man kết thúc. Phần không giới thiệu, phần sau modifier. The first gray light of dawn was seeping into the hidden canyon when Elena stirred from her restless sleep. Her shoulder throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, but the sharp agony of the previous evening had subsided to something manageable. She opened her eyes to find Cale crouched beside the dying embers of their fire, his rifle across his knees, and his dark eyes scanning the narrow entrance to their sanctuary. "They are still out there," he said quietly, not turning to look at her. "I heard them pass by the entrance twice during the night. They know we are somewhere in this area, but they have not found the opening." Elena sat up carefully, testing the range of motion in her injured arm. The doeskin bandage was still secure, and while movement was painful, she retained most of the use of her shoulder. "How long before they find us?" "That depends on how patient they are willing to be," Kyle replied, finally turning to meet her gaze. "Marcus Barrow is not a man known for his patience, but he is known for his persistence. He will not give up easily." As if summoned by the mention of his name, the sound of approaching voices echoed faintly from beyond the canyon walls. Kyle immediately moved to extinguish the last glowing coals of their fire, scattering them and covering the ashes with sand and stones until no trace remained of their presence. "Can you ride?" he asked, moving to where his stallion stood, cropping grass near the spring. "I can do whatever is necessary," Elena replied, though she wasn't entirely certain that was true. Her legs felt unsteady as she stood, and her head swam slightly from blood loss and exhaustion. Kyle studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "We will need to leave soon, but first we must know what we face." Moving with the silent grace of a hunting cat, he disappeared into the maze of rocks and crevices that surrounded their hidden refuge. Elena waited, listening to the gradually intensifying voices of their pursuers, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird seeking freedom. When Kyle returned 20 minutes later, his expression was grim. 12 men, he reported quietly. 6 of Barrow's regular hands and 6 bounty hunters from out of territory. They are well armed and well supplied. This will not be a pursuit that ends with nightfall. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Bounty hunters. But I was never formally charged with a crime that carried a reward. "Barrow has posted his own bounty," Kale explained, checking the loads in his rifle. $500 for you, dead or alive. Another $500 for me. Word will spread quickly through the territory. Soon every gun for hire from El Paso to Denver will be hunting us. The weight of that revelation settled over Elena like a burial shroud. $1,000 was more money than most men in the territory saw in 5 years. For that sum, good men might be tempted to do evil things, and evil men would stop at nothing to claim the prize. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant for you to be caught up in this. You should leave me here and save yourself while you still can." Kyle's response was to reach out and gently touch her uninjured cheek with his fingertips. The gesture was so unexpected, so tender, that Elena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "My grandfather used to say that the path of honor is never the easy path," he said softly. "If I wanted an easy life, I would have stayed on the reservation and learned to plow fields like a white farmer, but some things are worth more than safety." Before Elena could respond, the voices of their pursuers grew suddenly louder and more urgent. Someone had found something, perhaps their tracks from the previous evening or some other sign of their passage. "Time to go," Kyle said, swinging into his saddle and extending his hand to help Elena mount behind him. As they prepared to leave their temporary sanctuary, Elena took one last look around the hidden canyon. The ancient pictographs on the walls seemed to watch their departure with the wisdom of ages, and she found herself wondering how many other fugitives had found refuge in this place over the centuries. Kyle guided his horse toward the narrow passage that led to the outside world, but instead of heading for the entrance they had used the night before, he turned toward what appeared to be a solid wall of rock at the canyon's far end. "Trust me," he said quietly, sensing Elena's confusion. As they drew closer to the seemingly impenetrable barrier, Elena realized that what had appeared to be solid stone was actually an optical illusion, created by the way 2 massive rock formations overlapped. There was indeed a passage there, but so narrow and well concealed that only someone intimately familiar with the terrain would ever find it. They squeezed through the hidden opening just as the voices of their pursuers echoed from the main entrance behind them. Elena held her breath, certain that the sound of their horses' hooves on stone would give them away, but Kyle had wrapped the stallion's feet with strips of hide that muffled the noise almost completely. The secret passage led them through a labyrinth of interconnected canyons and mesas, each turn revealing new wonders carved by wind and water over countless millennia. For nearly an hour they traveled through this maze of stone, the voices of pursuit growing fainter and more frustrated behind them. Finally, they emerged onto a high plateau that offered a commanding view of the surrounding desert. The sun was well up now, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson that took Elena's breath away despite their desperate circumstances. There, Kyle said, pointing toward a line of green in the distance, "The Rio Esperanza. If we can reach it, we will have water and cover, and beyond it lies territory where Barrow's influence grows thin." The river was perhaps 10 miles away across open desert, a dangerous stretch where they would be visible to anyone with a spyglass, but it was their best hope of escape. Kyle's stallion was strong and had been rested through the night while their pursuers' horses had been ridden hard in the darkness. They descended from the plateau at a controlled gallop, the horses' hooves drumming a rhythm of urgency against the hard-pan earth. Behind them, dust clouds began to appear as their hunters finally extracted themselves from the canyon maze and resumed the chase. The morning grew steadily hotter as they rode the sun climbing toward its merciless zenith. Elena's wounded shoulder ached with each jarring impact of the horse's gait, but she gritted her teeth and endured. Complaining would serve no purpose except to slow their escape. "Tell me about your life before this," Kyle said as they paused briefly to rest the horse and take a drink from his water bag. "What brought you to speak against Barrow when so many others remained silent?" Elena considered the question as she savored the precious water. "I was married once," she began slowly, "to a good man named David Marlowe. He was a mining engineer who came west to make his fortune in the silver fields. We met at a church social in Denver, and within 6 months we were married and heading for the territories." She paused, lost in memories both sweet and painful. "David was innocent, I suppose. He believed that hard work and honest dealing would always triumph over corruption. When we settled in Dry Creek, he saw it as a place where a man could build something lasting." Kyle waited patiently as she gathered her thoughts, his dark eyes never leaving the horizon where their pursuers might appear at any moment. "David discovered irregularities in the mining claims around Dry Creek," Elena continued. "False surveys, forged documents, intimidation of legitimate claim holders. When he tried to report it to the territorial authorities, he was told that local matters should be handled locally. When he tried to handle it locally..." Her voice broke slightly and Kyle reached out to touch her hand. "He was found dead at the bottom of Widow's Gulch," she finished. "They called it an accident, said his horse must have spooked and thrown him, but David was the finest horseman in 3 counties. He never would have fallen, not like that." "And you knew who was responsible," Kyle said. "It wasn't a question. Everyone knew," Elena replied bitterly. "But knowing and proving are different things. And in Dry Creek, proof isn't necessary when you have enough gold to buy silence. So I held my tongue for 2 years, played the grieving widow, and waited for my chance to see justice done." "What changed?" Elena's green eyes hardened with remembered fury. "Sarah Mitchell's husband, Tom Bradley's daughter, a dozen other good people who died or disappeared because they stood in Marcus Barrow's way. I realized that staying silent wasn't protecting me, it was protecting him, and I couldn't live with that anymore." Their conversation was interrupted by the distant crack of a rifle shot, followed by the distinctive whistle of a bullet passing overhead. Their pursuers had finally emerged from the canyons and had spotted them across the open desert. "Hold tight," Kyle warned, and his stallion leaped forward into a dead run. What followed was a nightmare chase across terrain that seemed designed by the devil himself to break both horses and riders. They thundered across alkali flats where the white dust burned their eyes and choked their lungs, wove between stands of prickly pear and cholla that could cripple a horse with a single misstep, and leaped arroyos that gaped like open wounds in the desert floor. Behind them, their pursuers had spread out in a line using their superior numbers to prevent any chance of escape to the north or south. The only option was to continue west toward the river, hoping that Kael's stallion could maintain its lead long enough to reach the safety of the cottonwoods that lined the Rio Esperanza. More rifle shots rang out, but the range was still too great for accurate shooting from horseback. Elena could see individual riders, now their faces grim with determination beneath their broad-brimmed hats. At the center of the line rode Marcus Barrow himself, his expensive clothes already stained with dust and sweat, but his posture still radiating the arrogant confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "The river!" Elena shouted over the thunder of hooves and the whistle of wind in their ears. The line of green was much closer now, perhaps 2 miles away, and Elena could see the silver glint of water through the trees. But their pursuers were gaining ground, their fresher horses beginning to close the gap that had protected them through the morning. Kael's stallion was breathing hard now, foam flecking its muzzle, but the magnificent animal showed no signs of giving up. Like its master, it seemed driven by some inner fire that refused to acknowledge defeat, even in the face of overwhelming odds. They crashed through the first line of brush along the riverbank in an explosion of leaves and branches. The stallion barely hesitated before plunging into the swift-flowing water, its powerful legs churning against the current as it swam toward the far bank. Elena gasped as the cold water closed over her legs, soaking through her already tattered dress and sending shock waves of pain through her wounded shoulder. But the river that threatened to drag them to their deaths also offered their best hope of escape. Gunfire erupted from the bank behind them as their pursuers reached the water's edge. Bullets whined overhead and splashed into the water around them, but the motion of the swimming horse made them difficult targets. Elena pressed herself low against Kael's back, making herself as small as possible, while he guided their mount with expert skill toward the safety of the far shore. They reached the opposite bank just as the first of their pursuers entered the water. Kael's stallion scrambled up the muddy slope with the last of its strength, then stood trembling with exhaustion among the cottonwoods that offered blessed concealment from the rifles across the river. "We cannot stop," Kael said, though Elena could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "They will be across in minutes, and the horse needs time to recover." They pressed deeper into the riverside forest, following what appeared to be an old game trail that wound between the massive tree trunks. The canopy above filtered the harsh desert sunlight into a green twilight that was almost peaceful after the blazing intensity of the chase. But peace was a luxury they couldn't afford. Behind them, Elena could hear the sounds of their pursuers crossing the river, shouted commands, splashing water, and the snorting of horses being driven harder than they were meant to go. The trail led them to a clearing where an ancient cottonwood larger than all the rest stood like a cathedral pillar reaching toward the sky. At its base, someone had built a small cabin years ago, though it was now abandoned and slowly being reclaimed by the forest. The roof had partially collapsed and vines had begun to cover the walls, but the structure still offered some shelter. "We rest here," Kael decided, dismounting and helping Elena down from the exhausted horse. 5 minutes for the stallion to catch his breath, then we continue. Elena collapsed onto a fallen log, her legs finally giving out completely. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the morning was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that made every movement an effort. "I can't," she whispered. "I'm sorry, but I just can't go on." Kael knelt beside her, his dark eyes studying her face with concern. "You can," he said firmly. "You are stronger than you know. But strength alone is not enough. We need a plan." What kind of plan? Instead of answering immediately, Kyle moved to his horse and began removing items from his saddlebags. Ammunition, dried food, a coil of rope, and various other supplies that spoke of a man accustomed to living off the land. "They expect us to run," he said as he worked, "to keep fleeing westward until we are too exhausted to continue, but there is another way." Elena watched him with growing apprehension as he checked his rifle and began loading additional cartridges into his belt. "You're talking about fighting them." "I am talking about evening the odds," Kyle replied calmly. 12 men are too many to face in open battle, but 12 men spread out through dense forest, uncertain of where their quarry might be hiding, become much more vulnerable. The sound of approaching horses was growing louder now. Their brief respite was almost over. "Can you climb?" Kyle asked, looking up at the massive cottonwood that dominated the clearing. Elena followed his gaze to the sturdy branches that spread out 20 feet above their heads. The tree was indeed climbable with convenient handholds and a thick canopy that would provide excellent concealment. But with her wounded shoulder, "I can try," she said. "That is all any warrior can do," Kyle replied. And for the first time since their escape began, Elena thought she detected the hint of a smile in Bihimhimda's dark eyes. He helped boost her up to the lowest branch, then followed with his rifle slung across his back. Together they climbed higher into the green sanctuary, finding a position where they could see the clearing below while remaining hidden among the leaves. They reached their vantage point just as the first of their pursuers entered the clearing. Elena recognized him as Jake Morrison, one of Barrow's regular hands, a man she had known by sight for 3 years, but who now looked at the world through the cold eyes of a hunter. Morrison dismounted and began studying the ground for tracks, his movements cautious and professional. Behind him, other riders began to filter into the clearing, their horses blowing hard from the chase. "They stopped here," Morrison called out. "Tracks show the horse was favoring its right front leg. They can't have gone much further." Marcus Barrow himself entered the clearing, his face flushed with anger and exertion. "I don't care if their horse is dying," he snarled. "I want that woman found and brought back, and I want the Indian's scalp as a warning to any other savages who might consider interfering with my business." Elena felt Kyle's body tense at the racial slur, but he remained motionless in the branches above. This was not the time for righteous anger, it was the time for patience and planning. "Split up," Barrow continued. "Morrison, take 3 men and follow the main trail. Henderson, you and your boys check the riverbank for sign. The rest of you spread out and search every inch of this forest. They're wounded, exhausted, and on foot. This ends today." As the men began to disperse, Elena felt Kyle's hand touch her arm gently. When she looked at him, he pointed toward a cluster of thick branches about 10 feet away, a position that would give him a clear shot at anyone in the clearing while keeping him completely concealed. Moving with infinite care, he began to work his way toward the new position, leaving Elena hidden in her original spot. She watched him go with a mixture of admiration and terror, knowing that what happened in the next few minutes would determine whether they lived or died. The clearing below had emptied except for 2 men, a bounty hunter named Cole Brandt, who Elena recognized from wanted posters in the sheriff's office, and one of Barrow's newer hands, whose name she didn't know. They were engaged in a quiet conversation, their voices barely audible from her perch in the tree. "500 each is good money," Brandt was saying, "but I'm thinking we might be able to do better." "What do you mean?" Brandt glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard, then lowered his voice even further. "That woman knows things about Barrow's operation, things that certain people in the territorial capital would pay good money to hear. We take her alive, keep her somewhere safe, and see how much her testimony is worth before we decide whether to turn her over to Barrow or to his enemies." Elena's blood ran cold as she listened to the casual discussion of her fate. These men weren't just hunting her for the bounty, they were planning to sell her to the highest bidder like a piece of livestock. "And the Indian, him we kill," Brant said matter-of-factly. "No point keeping a savage alive when there's only money in his scalp." That was when Cale made his move. His rifle spoke once, a sharp crack that echoed through the forest like thunder. Cole Brant spun around and dropped to the ground, clutching his shoulder and screaming curses that would have made a sailor blush. The second man fumbled for his pistol, but before he could clear leather, another rifle shot rang out from somewhere else in the forest. He dropped his weapon and dove behind a fallen log, shouting for help at the top of his lungs. Within seconds, the clearing was full of running men, all of them firing wildly at shadows, while their quarry remained safely hidden in the canopy above. In the chaos and confusion, it was impossible for them to tell where the shots were coming from or how many enemies they faced. "There in the trees," someone shouted, and a volley of rifle fire shredded the leaves around Elena's hiding place. She pressed herself against the trunk of the ancient cottonwood and prayed that the massive tree would protect her from the storm of bullets. But Kyle was no longer beside her. Moving from tree to tree with the silent skill of his ancestors, he had become a ghost in the forest, striking without warning and then vanishing before his enemies could respond. Another shot rang out, and another of Barrow's men cried out in pain. "Stop shooting at shadows!" Marcus Barrow roared above the chaos. "You're wasting ammunition and shooting at each other. Form up in a line and advance slowly." It was sound tactical advice, but Kyle was ready for it. As the remaining hunters began to organize themselves into a coherent fighting force, he appeared at the base of Elena's tree, his rifle smoking in his hands. "Time to go," he said quietly. "They will be more careful now, but they have also been reduced to 8 men. The odds improve." Elena climbed down as quickly as her wounded shoulder would allow her, heart hammering with the excitement and terror of the brief battle. "Where's your horse?" "Safe," Cale replied, leading her toward the thick undergrowth at the edge of the clearing. "But we go on foot from here. In dense forest, a man afoot has advantages over a man on horseback." They slipped into the green maze of the riverside forest, just as Barrow's reorganized men began their methodical advance. Behind them, Elena could hear the cattle baron's voice raised in frustrated anger as he realized that his overwhelming advantage in numbers was being systematically eroded by an enemy he couldn't see or catch. The hunt had become a war, and for the first time since their desperate flight began, Elena dared to hope that they might actually survive it. Reessayer TS Part 3. Lưu ý viết 8.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện. Pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liên mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần, duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kẻ theo ngôi thứ 3 giữ độ kịch tính không viết, lần màn kết thúc phần không giới thiệu, phần sau. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document modifier TU. The riverside forest had become a maze of death and deception, where every shadow might conceal an enemy, and every rustling leaf could herald a bullet. Cale moved through this green labyrinth with the fluid grace of a predator born to such terrain, while Elena followed as quietly as her inexperience would allow, stepping carefully in his footsteps to avoid breaking branches or disturbing the carpet of fallen leaves. Behind them, the systematic search continued, but with noticeably less enthusiasm than before. The hunters had become the hunted, and the psychological impact of Kyle's guerrilla tactics was beginning to show. Voices that had been confident and commanding now carried undertones of uncertainty and fear. "We need to get to higher ground," Kyle whispered as they paused beside a massive fallen tree whose upturned root system created a natural fortress. "From there I can see their positions and choose my targets more carefully." Elena nodded, though the thought of more violence made her stomach churn. She had lived her entire life as a civilized woman, settling disputes with words rather than weapons, believing in the power of law and reason to solve conflicts. Now she found herself in a world where survival depended on the skillful application of deadly force, and the adjustment was proving more difficult than she had anticipated. They began to work their way up the steep slope that rose from the river bottom toward the mesa beyond. The terrain was treacherous, loose rock and shifting soil that could betray their position with a single misstep, but it also provided excellent concealment from the searchers below. As they climbed, Elena became aware of a new sound, mixing with the shouts and curses of their pursuers, the steady beat of approaching hoofbeats from the direction they had originally come. Someone else was joining the hunt.
"More men,"
she whispered. Kyle paused to listen, his head cocked at an angle that reminded Elena of a wolf testing the wind. After a moment, his expression darkened. "Not just men. Those horses are shod in the cavalry style. Barrow has called in the army." The implications hit Elena like a physical blow. If federal troops were now involved, their status had changed from fugitives fleeing local justice to enemies of the United States government. There would be no sanctuary anywhere in the territories, no place to hide or rest until they were captured or killed. "How many?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "A full troop by the sound of it. Perhaps 30 men, all well armed and trained for this kind of work." Kyle resumed his careful ascent, but Elena could see the tension in his shoulders. Even a warrior of his skill could not fight 40-plus enemies in open combat. They reached a rocky outcrop that provided both concealment and a commanding view of the forest below. From this vantage point, Elena could see the blue uniforms of cavalry soldiers deploying among the trees in well-organized search patterns. At their head rode a man whose bearing and uniform marked him as an experienced officer. "Lieutenant Colonel Harrison Wade," Cale said quietly, apparently recognizing the figure. "I have encountered him before during the Apache campaigns. He is competent and ruthless, but not without honor. He will not torture prisoners or harm innocents without cause. That's supposed to be comforting. It means he can be reasoned with if we can survive long enough to attempt it." Kyle checked the loads in his rifle, then began examining the terrain around their position. "But first, we must discourage some of his enthusiasm for this hunt." Elena watched in fascination and growing dread as Kyle selected his firing position with the methodical precision of a craftsman choosing the right tool for a delicate job. Every factor seemed to enter his calculations: wind direction, range, available cover, escape routes, and the likelihood of return fire from multiple directions. Below them, the combined force of civilians and soldiers had begun a methodical sweep of the forest floor. They moved with professional competence, now the cavalrymen's experience lending direction and discipline to what had been a chaotic manhunt. But their very organization also made them predictable, and Kyle was a student of human nature as well as warfare. "There," he said softly, indicating a position where the search line had to funnel between two large boulders. "When they pass through that gap, they will be focused on the ground ahead of them. They will not think to look up." Elena found herself holding her breath as the soldiers approached the natural bottleneck. In the lead was a young sergeant whose face showed the kind of intense concentration that marked a man trying very hard to impress his superiors. Behind him came 3 more troopers, their carbines held ready, but their attention focused on the ground they were searching rather than the rocky outcrop above. Cale's rifle spoke once, the sound sharp and final in the afternoon air. The young sergeant spun around and dropped, clutching his leg and crying out in pain and surprise. But Cale had not aimed to kill. The wound was painful, but not life-threatening, designed to remove an enemy from the fight without taking his life unnecessarily. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of rifles opened fire on their position, filling the air with lead and the sharp crack of splintering rock. Elena pressed herself into the smallest possible space behind a boulder while chips of stone rained down around them like deadly hail. But when the initial volley ended and the soldiers paused to reload, Kyle was no longer there. He had moved during the chaos, flowing like smoke through cracks in the rock, to a new position 50 yards away. His second shot came from an entirely unexpected direction, dropping another trooper with a bullet through the shoulder. "Spread out!" Lieutenant Colonel Wade's voice rang with authority across the forest. "He's mobile and knows this terrain. Don't bunch up and give him easy targets." The manhunt had evolved again, becoming a deadly game of cat and mouse, played across several acres of broken terrain. Kyle used every trick his ancestors had learned in their centuries of warfare: misdirection, camouflage, patience, and the ability to strike without warning from unexpected directions. Elena found herself caught between admiration and horror as she watched him work. Each shot was precisely placed, each movement calculated to maximum effect. He never killed when wounding would suffice, but he showed no hesitation when lethal force was the only option. 3 more soldiers fell to his rifle before Lieutenant Colonel Wade called for a temporary halt to regroup and reassess the situation. "Impressive!" came a voice from directly behind Elena, causing her heart to nearly stop with terror. She spun around to find herself face to face with a man she didn't recognize, tall, lean, and dressed in the practical clothing of a professional tracker. He held a rifle pointed casually in her direction, but his finger was on the trigger and his eyes were alert, with the kind of predatory intelligence that marked a truly dangerous individual. "Don't move, don't call out, and you'll live a few minutes longer," the man continued in a conversational tone. "My name is Cole Brandt, though I suspect your red-skinned friend already knows that. He put a bullet in my shoulder this morning, which makes this somewhat personal." Elena's mind raced as she stared at the bounty hunter. She remembered seeing him fall in the clearing, but apparently his wound had been less serious than it appeared. While everyone else was focused on Kyle's hit-and-run tactics, Brandt had been working his way around to their position from an entirely different direction. "Where is he?" Brandt asked, pressing the barrel of his rifle against Elena's temple. "I know he's close, or you wouldn't be here alone. Call him back nice and quiet, or I'll paint these rocks with your brains." "He's gone," Elena lied, hoping that Kyle was indeed out of immediate range. "He left me here and continued up the mountain, said I was slowing him down." Brandt's laugh was cold and humorless. "Nice try, lady, but I've been tracking men and women across this territory for 15 years. That Indian wouldn't abandon you any more than a wolf would abandon his mate. He's here somewhere, probably trying to get a clean shot at me right now." As if summoned by the bounty hunter's words, a stone clattered down from somewhere above their position. Brandt's head snapped up his rifle, swinging toward the sound, but the movement was exactly what Kyle had been waiting for. The Comanche warrior seemed to materialize from the rock face itself, dropping silently onto Brandt's back with the impact of a mountain cat taking down prey. The 2 men went down in a tangle of arms and legs, rolling dangerously close to the edge of the rocky outcrop. Elena scrambled backward as the deadly struggle played out before her. Both men were professionals trained in the arts of violence, and neither gave quarter. Brandt was larger and stronger, but Kyle had the advantages of surprise and desperation. They fought with knives now, their rifles forgotten in the intensity of hand-to-hand combat. The bounty hunter managed to pin Kyle briefly, his blade seeking the warrior's throat, but Kyle twisted at the last second and drove his own knife up under Brandt's ribs. The man's eyes went wide with shock and pain, then slowly glazed over as life left his body. "Are you hurt?" Kyle asked, as he rose from the dead bounty hunter, his breathing heavy, but his voice steady. "No, but they'll have heard the noise," Elena replied, gesturing toward the forest below, where shouts of alarm were already rising from the search parties. "Then we move now before they can surround this position completely." Kyle quickly searched Brandt's body, taking his ammunition and a purse of gold coins before leading Elena toward what appeared to be an impassable cliff face. But appearances, Elena was learning, could be deceiving in this land of hidden passages and optical illusions. What looked like solid rock was actually the entrance to a narrow chimney that climbed up through the heart of the mesa. The passage was barely wide enough for one person at a time, and in some places, Elena had to exhale completely to squeeze through, but it led them steadily upward and away from their pursuers. They emerged onto the mesa top just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. The view from their new vantage point was spectacular. Hundreds of square miles of desert and mountain country spread out like a vast map beneath them. But Elena's attention was focused on the more immediate sight of their enemies deploying in the forest below. "They're surrounding the base of the mesa," she observed, counting the small figures that moved with purposeful intent among the trees. "How do we get down from here?" "We don't," Kyle replied, studying the terrain with the eye of a military tactician. "At least not the way we came up, but there are other paths known only to my people. Paths that lead to places where even the cavalry cannot follow." He pointed towards the northern edge of the mesa, where the rock face dropped away into a canyon so deep and narrow that its bottom was lost in purple shadows. That canyon connects to a system of caves and passages that extend for many miles underground. My grandfather showed them to me when I was a boy before the reservation days. If we can reach them, we will be safe for as long as we need to be. Elena looked at the indicated direction and felt her stomach lurch. Getting to the canyon would require crossing nearly a mile of open mesa top, fully exposed to anyone watching from below. And once they reached it, they would have to find some way to descend a cliff face that appeared to be absolutely vertical. "Can your people's paths be seen from below?" she asked. "Not if we are careful, but there is another problem." Kyle's expression had grown troubled as he continued to study their situation. "The passage I am thinking of requires two people working together, one to anchor the rope, one to descend first and secure the bottom with your injured shoulder." "I can do whatever is necessary," Elena said firmly, though she felt far from confident. "What choice do we have?" Before Kyle could answer, the distinctive crack of a rifle shot echoed from below, followed immediately by the whine of a bullet passing uncomfortably close to Elena's head. Someone in the search party had spotted them on the mesa top. "No choice at all," Kyle agreed grimly. "Stay low and follow me, and whatever happens, don't look back until we reach the canyon edge." They began their desperate dash across the exposed mesa top as more rifles opened fire from the forest below. The range was extreme for accurate shooting, but with dozens of marksmen firing, some bullets were bound to come close. Elena heard the deadly whispers passing over her head and the sharp cracks as others struck the rock around them, sending up spurts of pulverized stone. Halfway across the mesa, disaster struck. Elena's boot caught in a crack between two rocks, sending her tumbling forward with a cry of pain and alarm. Her injured shoulder struck the ground hard, sending waves of agony through her entire body and causing her vision to gray at the edges. Kyle was beside her in an instant, helping her to her feet, despite the increased danger of remaining stationary under fire. "Can you run?" Elena gritted her teeth and nodded, though she wasn't entirely certain it was true. Her shoulder felt as if it were on fire, and her ankle had twisted in the fall, making each step a torment. But the alternative to running was death, and that was not an acceptable option. They reached the canyon edge just as the volume of fire from below increased dramatically. Lieutenant Colonel Wade had apparently repositioned some of his men to get better angles on the mesa top, and the accuracy of their shooting was improving steadily. The view down into the canyon was even more terrifying than Elena had expected. The rock face dropped away into shadowy depths that seemed to have no bottom, while the opposite wall rose like a monument to the impossibility of escape. But Kyle was already moving his hands, running along the cliff edge with the certainty of long familiarity. "Here," he said, indicating a spot where the rock face was broken by a series of narrow ledges and cracks. "This is the path my grandfather showed me. It looks impossible, but appearances lie." Elena stared at what he was calling a path and saw nothing but certain death. The first ledge was barely 6 inches wide and lay 20 feet below the rim, reachable only by lowering oneself over the edge and feeling blindly for footholds in the rock face. "I'll go first," Kyle continued, uncoiling the rope he had taken from his saddlebags that morning. "When I reach the first secure position, I'll signal for you to follow. Trust the rope, trust your feet, and don't look down." Before Elena could voice any of the dozen objections that came to mind, Kyle tied one end of the rope around a sturdy outcrop of rock and secured the other end around his waist. Then, with a calmness that defied their desperate circumstances, he backed over the canyon edge and disappeared from sight. Elena crawled to the rim and peered down, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. Kyle was already 30 feet below, moving across the rock face with the grace and confidence of a mountain goat. As she watched, he reached a ledge wide enough to stand on and looked up at her with an expression that managed to be both encouraging and urgent. The sound of approaching horses from the mesa top behind her made the decision for her. Lieutenant Colonel Wade's men had found a way up onto the mesa, and she could hear their voices growing closer by the minute. In moments, they would reach the canyon edge and have clear shots at both her and Kyle. Elena tied the rope around her own waist with hands that shook despite her efforts to control them. Then, closing her eyes and whispering a prayer to whatever gods might be listening, she backed over the edge of the canyon and began her descent into the abyss. The first few moments were pure terror as her feet scrambled for purchase on the smooth rock face, while her injured shoulders screamed in protest at supporting her weight. But gradually, following Kyle's shouted instructions from below, she found the rhythm of the descent: small steps, careful handholds, and above all, the absolute necessity of not looking down into the depths that yawned beneath her. She had covered perhaps 15 feet when the first rifle shots rang out from the canyon rim above. The soldiers had reached the edge and were firing down at them, but the extreme angle made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Most of the bullets struck the rock face well wide of their targets, though a few came close enough to shower Elena with fragments of pulverized stone. "Faster," Kale called from below. "The rope will not hold both our weight if they cut it." Elena forced herself to move more quickly, ignoring the pain in her shoulder and the growing weakness in her arms. Each foot of descent took her farther from the rifles above, but closer to the terrifying possibility of falling into the canyon's shadowy depths. She reached Kyle's ledge just as the rope above them went slack, not cut by bullets, but untied by soldiers who had reached the anchor point. The length of rope that connected them to safety came snaking down the cliff face, leaving them stranded on a ledge barely 3 feet wide with no apparent way to continue their descent. "Now what?" Elena gasped, pressing herself against the rock wall and trying not to think about the hundreds of feet of empty air behind her. "Now we use the path our ancestors left for us," Kale replied, pointing to what appeared to be a crack in the rock face. "This canyon was sacred to my people for generations before the white man came. They carved steps and handholds that the wind and weather have hidden from casual view, but they are still there for those who know how to look." Elena studied the crack he indicated and gradually began to see what he meant. What had appeared to be natural flaws in the rock were actually carefully carved indentations, each one positioned to provide secure footing or handholds for someone making this treacherous descent. The craftsmanship was so subtle that only someone intimately familiar with the route would ever recognize it as human work. They continued their descent using this ancient highway, moving from ledge to ledge and handhold to handhold with increasing confidence as Elena learned to trust the skill of the long-dead craftsmen who had created their escape route. Above them, the rifle fire had ceased as the soldiers realized their quarry had moved beyond effective range. The sun was setting by the time they reached the canyon floor, painting the narrow strip of sky. above them in brilliant shades of orange and red. Elena collapsed onto a boulder beside the small stream that ran along the bottom of the canyon, her legs shaking with exhaustion and reaction. "We made it," she whispered, hardly daring to believe they had survived the nightmare of the past few hours. "We made it this far," Kyle corrected, though his tone was not unkind. "But they will find ways to follow us down, and there are other dangers in these depths that bullets cannot harm." Even as he spoke, Elena became aware of the absolute silence that surrounded them in the canyon. No bird songs, no insect sounds, not even the whisper of wind through the rocks. It was as if they had descended not just into the earth, but into some realm where life itself held its breath in waiting. "What kind of dangers?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. Kyle's dark eyes surveyed the canyon walls that rose like prison bars around them. Flash floods when storms strike the mesa above, poisonous snakes that hunt in the darkness, and stories my grandmother told of things that were old when the world was young, things that do not welcome intruders in their domain. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rapidly cooling air. "Stories. Every people has such stories," Kyle replied philosophically. "Things that live in the deep places, things that hunger for what the surface world possesses. Most are just tales told to frighten children away from dangerous places, but some—" He paused, listening to something Elena couldn't hear. "Some have truth in them." From somewhere deeper in the canyon came a sound that made the hair on Elena's neck stand up, a low, mournful cry that seemed to echo from the very bones of the earth. It was not quite human and not quite animal, but something that belonged to neither world and both. "What was that?" Elena whispered to it. Kyle's hand had moved instinctively to his rifle. "I do not know," he admitted, "and that troubles me more than I can say." The cry came again, closer this time, followed by what sounded like the scrape of claws on stone. Whatever was making the sound was moving toward them through the labyrinth of side passages that branched off from the main canyon. "We need to move," Kyle said quietly. "The caves I spoke of are still a mile deeper into the canyon. If we can reach them before full darkness falls." They gathered their few possessions and began walking deeper into the narrow gorge, their footsteps echoing softly from the towering walls that hemmed them in on both sides. Behind them, the strange cries continued, sometimes close and sometimes distant, but always present, like a reminder that they were no longer the apex predators in this ancient landscape. As night fell over the canyon and the first stars appeared in the narrow strip of sky above, Elena found herself clinging to Kyle's hand, not just for guidance, but for the simple human comfort of contact with another living soul. Whatever awaited them in the depths ahead, they would face it together, and somehow that made even the unknown terrors seem less overwhelming. The sound of their pursuers seemed very far away now, lost in the world above where men fought with guns and gold for control of a land they would never truly understand. Down here in the ancient depths, different rules applied and different dangers waited, but they were alive, they were together, and they were free. For now, that had to be enough.
Recitations Part 4. Lưu ý viết 9.500 từ liên kết liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện. Pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề. Phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ ba, giữ độ kịch tính không việc. Lan man kết thúc phần không giới thiệu. Phần sau modifier the deeper, they ventured into the canyon's heart. The more Elena felt as though they were descending, not just through rock and stone, but through layers of time itself. The walls around them bore the scars of millennia watermarks,
from ancient floods petroglyphs, whose meanings had been lost with the peoples who carved them, and strange formations that seemed almost too deliberate to be natural. The mysterious cries had grown more frequent as darkness settled over the canyon, echoing from unseen passages that branched off into the bowels of the earth. Sometimes the sounds seemed to come from directly ahead of them, sometimes from behind and occasionally from above, as if whatever made them could move through the solid rock itself. "There," Cale said, softly, pointing to a section of the canyon wall where the moonlight revealed what appeared to be a natural archway, the entrance to the cave system. "Once we are inside, we will be safe from pursuit." But he hesitated, and Elena felt her heart sink. In their desperate flight, she had learned that Kyle's hesitations usually preceded revelations of new dangers she hadn't considered. "But the caves are not empty," he replied, studying the dark opening with the wariness of a man who had faced unknown perils before. "My grandfather spoke of things that live in the deep places, things that were old. When his grandfather's grandfather was young, he said they were not evil exactly, but neither were they bound by the same rules that govern the world above." Elena stared at the cave entrance, which seemed to breathe with a life of its own in the shifting moonlight. What kind of things? Guardians, perhaps, or prisoners? The stories were never clear on that point. Kyle shouldered his rifle and began walking toward the archway. "But my grandfather also said that those who came to the caves with pure hearts and honest purpose were not harmed. They were tested." "Tested how?" "That in," Kyle said grimly, "is what we are about to discover." The cave entrance was larger than it had appeared, from a distance easily tall enough for them to walk upright and wide enough for 3 people to pass abreast. But the darkness beyond seemed to swallow their vision, completely creating the illusion that they were stepping not into a cave, but into the void itself. Kyle produced a torch from his pack and struck sparks with his flint and steel until the pitch-soaked wood caught fire. The sudden bloom of light revealed a passage that stretched ahead into the unknown, its walls decorated with paintings so vivid they seemed to move in the flickering illumination. Elena gasped as the firelight played across scenes of incredible beauty and terrifying strangeness. There were buffalo hunts and war parties, but also images of creatures she couldn't identify. Things with too many limbs or faces that seemed human, but possessed eyes like burning coals. In one particularly disturbing panel, human figures knelt before something that towered above them, its form so alien that her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. "My people did not paint these," Kyle said quietly, his voice carrying a note of unease Elena had never heard before. "These are far older, from the time before time, when the world was different than it is now." They walked deeper into the passage, their footsteps echoing strangely in the confined space. The sound seemed to take on a life of its own, multiplying and distorting until Elena couldn't tell whether what she heard was their own movement or something else entirely keeping pace with them in the darkness. The passage opened into a vast chamber whose ceiling disappeared into shadows beyond the reach of their torchlight. The floor was covered with sand so fine it felt like powder beneath their feet, and scattered across its surface were objects that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. Bones, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, arranged in patterns too precise to be natural. But these were not human remains. The skulls were too large, the limb bones too long and strangely jointed. Whatever creatures these bones had belonged to, they were like nothing that walked the earth in Elena's experience. "What happened here?" she whispered. "A battle, perhaps," Kyle replied, but his voice lacked conviction, or a sacrifice, or something else entirely. "The stories my grandfather told were fragments, pieces of a larger truth that was lost when the old ones passed into legend." As if summoned by his words, a new sound echoed through the chamber, not the animal cries they had heard in the canyon, but something that might have been singing if voices made of stone and wind could carry a tune. The melody was beautiful and terrible at the same time, filled with harmonies that no human throat could produce. "We should not be here," Elena said, backing toward the entrance they had used. But when she turned around, the passage was gone. Where the tunnel mouth had been, there was now only solid rock, as if the cave had sealed itself behind them. Kyle noticed her distress and followed her gaze to where the exit should have been. His face remained calm, but Elena saw his hand tighten on his rifle. "It seems we are committed to this path now." "The cave closed itself," Elena said, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. "That's impossible." "Many things that are impossible in the world above become possible in the deep places," Kyle replied philosophically. "We must trust that whatever force brought us here will also provide a way out when the time comes." The singing grew louder, more complex, as if additional voices were joining the ethereal chorus. But there was still no sign of the singers themselves, nothing to indicate where the music was coming from or who or what might be producing it. They walked across the bone-strewn floor toward what appeared to be another passage leading deeper into the cave system. As they moved, Elena became aware that the patterns formed by the scattered remains were not random, after all. Viewed from the proper angle, they seemed to tell a story, though what that story might be, she couldn't begin to guess. The second passage was narrower than the first, forcing them to walk single file with Kyle leading the way. The walls here were covered with symbols that seemed to shift and change in the torchlight, never quite the same when Elena looked directly at them as they had been in her peripheral vision. "Kyle," she said softly, not wanting to raise her voice in this place where echoes seemed to take on lives of their own. "I think we're being watched." "I know," he replied without turning around. "I can feel their eyes on us, but they have not acted against us, which suggests they are more curious than hostile. For now." They emerged into another chamber smaller than the first, but no less remarkable. This one contained what appeared to be an underground lake, its surface so perfectly still it might have been polished obsidian. Around its perimeter, carved from the living rock itself, stood a circle of figures that took Elena's breath away. They were human in general form, but possessed a beauty and perfection that seemed almost divine. Each figure was unique with different facial features and expressions, but all shared the same sense of otherworldly presence. Their eyes, carved with incredible skill, seemed to follow Elena and Kyle as they moved around the chamber's edge. "The old ones," Kyle breathed, and Elena heard genuine awe in his voice. "My grandfather described them, but I never truly believed until now." Who were they? The first people according to the oldest stories. They lived in the time before the sun and moon were placed in the sky, when the world was lit by fires that burned within the earth itself. They were wise beyond measure and powerful beyond imagining, but they were also different. Not quite human, as we understand the term. Elena stared at the carved figures and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cave's cool air. There was something in their expressions, a knowledge or understanding that seemed to pierce through time itself to judge her worth as a person. She found herself wondering what they saw when they looked at her and whether she would measure up to their ancient standards. The singing had grown louder still, and now Elena thought she could detect actual words in the ethereal chorus, though they were in no language she had ever heard. The melody was hypnotic, beautiful in a way that made her soul ache with longing for something she couldn't name. "The lake," Kyle said suddenly. "Look at the lake." Elena turned her attention to the dark water and gasped. The surface, which had been perfectly still moments before, was now covered with ripples that formed patterns too complex and deliberate to be natural. As she watched, the ripples began to glow with a soft phosphorescence that turned the entire chamber into a cathedral of living light. "What's happening?" she whispered. "I believe," Kyle said slowly, "that we are about to meet our hosts." The water in the center of the lake began to rise, forming a column that climbed steadily toward the chamber's ceiling. But this was not water as Elena understood it. The liquid maintained its form without any visible support, and the light within it pulsed with a rhythm that seemed to match her own heartbeat. As they watched in fascination and growing awe, the column began to take shape. Features emerged from the flowing water, a face of incredible beauty and alien perfection, eyes that held depths of knowledge accumulated over eons, and an expression that was both welcoming and utterly inhuman. When the figure spoke, its voice was the sound of streams flowing over stone of wind through caverns of the earth, itself breathing in the darkness of deep places. Why have you come to our sanctuary, children of the upper world? Elena found herself unable to speak, overwhelmed by the presence before them. But Kyle stepped forward, his manner respectful, but not subservient. We flee from those who would do us harm, he said simply. We seek sanctuary and safe passage to lands where we might begin again. And you? The water figure asked, its glowing eyes turning to Elena. What do you seek in the deep places? Elena struggled to find her voice, acutely aware that her answer might determine whether they lived or died in this strange realm. Justice, she said finally. I spoke truth when others remained silent, and for that they would see me destroyed. I seek a place where truth is valued more than gold. The figure was silent for a long moment, and Elena had the unsettling feeling that it was looking not just at her, but into her, reading the depths of her soul, with the same ease that she might read words on a page. Truth, the being said at last. Justice, noble concepts but abstractions nonetheless. Tell us, woman of the upper world, what truth did you speak that brought such wrath upon your head? Elena felt compelled to answer, as if some power beyond her own will was drawing the words from her lips. I spoke of murder and theft, of innocence destroyed for the greed of one man. I named Marcus Barrow for what he is, a man who has placed himself above the law and uses fear as his weapon. And you, warrior of the horse people, what justice do you seek? Kale's response came without hesitation. The justice of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The justice of standing against corruption even when standing alone. The justice of honoring the spirits of my ancestors by living according to their teachings. The water figure nodded slowly, its form shifting and flowing like liquid light. Your hearts are known to us now, and we find them acceptable. But knowledge of the heart is not enough. The deep places demand proof of character, demonstration of worth. Are you prepared to face the trials that will test not just your courage, but your very souls? Elena exchanged glances with Kyle, seeing her own mixture of fear and determination reflected in his dark eyes. They had come too far to turn back now, even if turning back were possible. We are ready, Kyle said, and Elena nodded her agreement, despite the terror that was building in her chest. Then let the testing begin. The chamber around them began to change, the walls flowing like water while the floor shifted beneath their feet. The lake disappeared along with the circle of carved figures, replaced by a landscape that belonged to no earthly realm Elena had ever imagined. They stood now on a plain of black glass beneath a sky filled with stars that pulsed with unnatural colors. In the distance, a city of impossible architecture rose toward the alien constellation's towers that spiraled through dimensions. Elena couldn't perceive bridges that connected to nothing and everywhere, and spires that seemed to be built from crystallized music. Where are we? Elena breathed. A place between places, come the answer, though the water figure was no longer visible. A realm where the fundamental nature of things is laid bare, where pretense and deception cannot exist. Here you will face what you truly are and what you might become. The first trial began without warning. Elena found herself standing alone on the glass plain, Kyle nowhere to be seen. The alien city had vanished as well, replaced by a scene that made her heart clench with pain and recognition. She was back in Dry Creek, but not the corrupt town she had fled. This was Dry Creek as it had been when she first arrived with David, a place of hope and possibility where good people worked together to build something worthwhile from the harsh wilderness. She could see her younger self walking hand in hand with her husband, both of them radiant with the joy of shared dreams and limitless future. "You could have this again," a voice whispered in her mind. "Forget your crusade for justice. Forget the pain and suffering. Accept the world as it is rather than demanding it be what it should be. Live quietly, cause no trouble, and you can have peace." The temptation was almost overwhelming. Elena could feel the phantom touch of David's hand in hers, could smell the sage and cedar smoke from their first little cabin, could hear his laughter as they planned their future together. All she had to do was accept that some battles couldn't be won, that some injustices had to be endured for the sake of personal happiness. "No," she said aloud, her voice carrying clearly across the impossible landscape. "David died because I remained silent when I should have spoken. Others died because I chose safety over justice. I will not dishonor their memory by choosing comfort over truth." The vision of peaceful Dry Creek wavered and dissolved, replaced by the glass plain once more. But now Elena could see Kyle in the distance, standing motionless as he faced his own trial. In his vision, Kyle stood in the midst of his people, as they had been before disease and warfare had claimed them all. His band was whole again, warriors in their prime, children playing in the grass, elders sharing wisdom around evening fires. His grandfather sat among them, no longer a memory but a living presence, ready to guide and counsel. "You are the last," the voice in his mind said, "the final keeper of their ways and traditions. Stay here with them in this place beyond time and death. Forget the harsh world above where their memory is trampled by those who see them only as obstacles to progress." Kyle felt the overwhelming temptation to accept, to lay down the burden of being the sole survivor and join those he had loved and lost. Here he would never be alone again, never have to watch the graves of his people being plowed under for farmland, never have to hear their sacred names spoken as curses by men who saw them only as savages to be eliminated. But then he thought of Elena, standing somewhere in this strange realm facing her own test. She had chosen to speak truth when silence would have been safer. She had accepted exile and danger rather than bow to corruption. How could he do less? "My people live on in my actions," he said firmly. "If I hide here with the dead, their spirits will truly die. But if I continue to walk the path of honor they taught me, if I use their wisdom to protect the innocent and fight for justice, then they achieve a different kind of immortality. I will not abandon my duty to them or to the woman who has become my partner in this quest." His vision dissolved as well, and suddenly he and Elena were standing together again on the glass plain. But the landscape around them had changed once more, transforming into something that belonged to neither of their experiences. They stood now in what appeared to be a vast courtroom, but one designed by minds that thought in terms of cosmic rather than human justice. The walls stretched up into infinity, covered with symbols and writing that seemed to contain the accumulated wisdom of ages. Above them, presences that might have been judges or witnesses hovered in forms too complex for human eyes to fully perceive. "The second trial," the voice announced, and Elena realized that multiple entities were speaking now, their voices layered in harmonies that created meaning beyond words. "You have shown that you can resist temptation and remain true to your principles. Now you must demonstrate wisdom in action." A scene appeared before them, vivid as life itself. Marcus Barrow knelt in chains before them, his arrogance finally broken, his crimes laid bare for all to see. Around him stood all those he had wronged, Sarah Mitchell's husband, Tom Bradley's daughter, David Marlowe, and dozens of others whose lives had been destroyed by his greed and ambition. "Justice at last," Elena breathed, feeling a fierce satisfaction at seeing her enemy humbled. "Yes," the voices agreed. He is in your power now, as you were once in his. What judgment would you pass upon this man who has caused such suffering?" Elena felt the weight of absolute authority settle upon her shoulders. She could demand any punishment, inflict any suffering, and it would be done. The temptation for revenge was almost as strong as the earlier temptation for peace. "Death," she said without hesitation. "He has murdered innocents and corrupted the very foundations of justice. He deserves to die for his crimes. And you, warrior, what would your judgment be?" Kael studied the kneeling figure with eyes that held no mercy. "Death as well. He has violated every code of honor known to civilized peoples. The world would be cleaner without him." "Then let it be done," the voices said, and Elena felt power flow through her, the ability to end Marcus Barrow's life with a thought. But as she prepared to pronounce the final sentence, something made her hesitate. Perhaps it was the memory of David's voice always counseling mercy even for those who had wronged him. Perhaps it was the realization that becoming an executioner, even of the guilty, would change something fundamental in her soul. "Wait," she said. I want him to face justice, true justice, not the corrupted mockery he created in Dry Creek, but real justice before judges who cannot be bought. I want his crimes exposed to the world, his victims vindicated, his stolen wealth returned to those he robbed. Death is too simple, too quick. He should live to see everything he built through violence and corruption torn down piece by piece." Kael nodded slowly. "She speaks wisdom. My people believed that true victory over an enemy was not to kill him, but to see him lose everything he valued while remaining alive to contemplate his downfall." "Mercy tempered with justice," the voices said, and Elena thought she detected approval in their ethereal tones. "You have passed the second trial, but one remains the most difficult of all. You have shown that you can resist temptation and exercise wisdom. Now you must demonstrate the strength to face the ultimate truth about yourselves." The courtroom dissolved, replaced by a simple stone chamber lit by torches that cast flickering shadows on the walls. Elena and Kael stood facing each other across a space that seemed both intimate and vast, while around them the presence of their judges waited with the patience of eternity. "The third trial is truth," the voices announced. "Not truth about your enemies or the world around you, but truth about yourselves. You must look into each other's souls without pretense or protection, see what is truly there, and accept or reject what you find. For if you cannot be honest with each other, how can you hope to build a life together based on anything more substantial than shared danger?" Elena felt a moment of panic as the implications became clear. She and Kael had been thrown together by circumstances, bonded by shared peril and common enemies. But did she really know this man who had risked everything to save her? And more importantly, would he still want to be with her if he saw past the grateful woman he had rescued, to the flawed, frightened, sometimes bitter person she really was? "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she admitted. "Nor I," Kael replied. "But perhaps that is why it is necessary." They moved closer to each other in the flickering torchlight, and Elena found herself looking into Kael's dark eyes with a depth of attention she had never given to any human being. At first, she saw only what she expected: strength, courage, honor, and intelligence. But as her gaze penetrated deeper, other things became visible. She saw the terrible loneliness that came from being the last of his people, an isolation so profound that it threatened to consume him from within. She saw the guilt he carried for surviving when others had, not the constant question of whether he deserved life when so many better people had died. She saw his fear that he was becoming more white than Comanche, losing the very identity he was trying to preserve. But she also saw the way he had fought against that despair, channeling it into a determination to live with such honor that his ancestors' spirits would be proud. She saw the gentle soul beneath the warrior's exterior, the man who would risk his life for a stranger, because his grandfather had taught him that protecting innocence was the highest calling. She saw his capacity for love carefully guarded, but deep as mountain lakes. "I see you," she whispered. "The pain and the strength, the doubt and the certainty. I see a man who chooses to be more than his circumstances demanded, who creates meaning from loss and purpose from despair." Cale was looking into her own soul with equal intensity, and Elena felt utterly exposed under his scrutiny. She wanted to look away to protect herself from the vulnerability of being truly known, but the power of the trial held her gaze steady. "I see anger in you," Cale said quietly. "Anger at the world's injustice, anger at your own powerlessness, anger at the good people who choose silence over conflict. But I also see that you have turned that anger into fuel for justice, rather than poison for your spirit. I see a woman who stands alone when necessary, but never stops hoping for companions on the path of right action." They stood in silence for a long moment, absorbing what they had seen in each other. Elena felt as if she had been turned inside out, every secret and shame laid bare, but also strangely cleansed by the experience. "Will you walk this path with me?" Cale asked. "Not as fugitives thrown together by chance, but as partners who choose each other with full knowledge of what that choice means." Elena felt tears on her cheeks as she nodded. "Yes, if you'll have me knowing what you now know." "I will have you," Cale said, and reached out to take her hands in his. "In the name of truth and justice, in honor of those we have lost, and in hope for what we might build together." The stone chamber filled with light so brilliant, it seemed to burn away all shadow and pretense. When Elena's vision cleared, they were standing once again beside the underground lake in the cave where their trials had begun. But something fundamental had changed, not just in their surroundings, but in themselves. "You have passed all 3 trials," the voices of the Deep One said, and now Elena could see them more clearly. Beings of water and light who moved through the liquid medium as easily as she moved through air. "You have proven your worth and your commitment to each other and to the principles you claim to serve. Therefore, we grant you safe passage through our realm and more." "More?" Elena asked. "The gift of sanctuary when you need it most," came the reply, "and the knowledge that you do not fight alone. There are others in the world above who work for justice in their own ways. Some wear badges, some carry Bibles, some wield pens instead of rifles. When the time comes, you will find them, and they will find you." The lake began to glow with renewed radiance, and Elena realized that a new passage had opened in the chamber wall, not the entrance they had used to arrive, but something different. "This path will take you beyond the reach of those who pursue you," the water beings explained. "But where it leads depends on the choices you make along the way. Choose wisely, children of the upper world, and remember that the deep places are always here for those who serve the true law that exists above human legislation." Elena and Cale walked toward the new passage, their hands linked, and their hearts lighter despite everything they had endured. Behind them, the ethereal singing resumed, a song of farewell and blessing that followed them into the tunnel beyond. They had passed through trials that tested their very souls and emerged stronger for it. Whatever lay ahead in the world above, they would face it together with the knowledge that their bond had been forged in the deepest places of truth and tested by forces beyond human understanding. The darkness ahead no longer seemed threatening but full of possibility, and Elena found herself looking forward to discovering what new chapter of their story was about to begin.
Reessayer Part Phang lưu ý viết tăng Kim nhìn từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ. Hoa Kỳ giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kẻ theo ngôi thứ ba giữ độ kịch tính không viết. Lan man kết thúc phần không giới thiệu. Phần sau không được phép nhảy sang document. Modifier, I hear the passage. Led them through winding tunnels that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, as if the very walls had absorbed some essence from the beings they had just encountered. Elena found herself marveling at how different she felt, not just physically, though her wounded shoulder had somehow stopped aching during their trials, but spiritually transformed. The woman who had walked into these caves was not quite the same one who now emerged from them. After what felt like hours but could have been minutes in that timeless realm, they saw daylight ahead. Not the harsh, unforgiving glare of the desert sun, but the gentle golden light of early dawn filtering through what appeared to be a grove of aspen trees. The contrast with the barren canyon they had left behind was so stark that Elena wondered if they had somehow traveled hundreds of miles during their underground journey. They emerged into a mountain meadow surrounded by peaks that Elena didn't recognize, though she had lived in the territories for most of her adult life. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the sound of running water. "Where are we?" she asked, turning in a slow circle to take in their surroundings. "I'm not entirely certain," Kyle admitted, though he didn't seem troubled by their mysterious relocation. "But I know these mountains exist somewhere north of where we began. My grandfather spoke of places like this, hidden valleys that could only be reached by those who had earned the right to find them." As if to confirm his words, a figure emerged from the tree line on the far side of the meadow. Elena's hand moved instinctively toward the gun Kyle had given her, but something in the approaching stranger's demeanor suggested peaceful intent rather than threat. The man who walked toward them was perhaps 60 years old, with silver-streaked hair and the weathered features of someone who had spent his life outdoors. He wore the simple clothing of a rancher or homesteader, but there was something in his bearing that spoke of education and refinement. Most remarkably, he showed no surprise at finding two fugitives emerging from what appeared to be solid rock. "Elena Marlowe and Cale Ironhorse," he said as he drew near, his voice carrying the slight accent of someone born in the eastern states but long adapted to frontier life. "I've been expecting you." Elena felt Cale tense beside her, his warrior instincts alert to the possibility of a trap. "Who are you?" he demanded. "My name is Samuel Porrison," the stranger replied calmly. "Federal Marshal, though I haven't worn the badge in some time. I was sent here by mutual friends, you might say. Friends who believe that justice sometimes requires unconventional methods." Elena studied Morrison's face, searching for any sign of deception. "How did you know we would be here?" Morrison's smile held depths of knowledge that reminded Elena uncomfortably of the beings they had just left behind. "Let's just say that there are networks of communication in this territory that go beyond telegraph wires and postal routes. When word came that two people of exceptional character were in need of assistance, I was asked to provide it." "What kind of assistance?" Cale asked, his hand still resting near his rifle. "The kind that involves bringing Marcus Barrow to justice through legal means rather than frontier vigilantism," Morrison replied, "though I understand the temptation for the latter given what you've both endured." Elena felt her heart leap at the implications. "You mean there's actually a way to expose his crimes, to see him face trial?" "More than that," Morrison said, gesturing for them to follow him toward the tree line. "There's been a federal investigation into territorial corruption for the past 2 years. Barrow's activities in Dry Creek have not gone unnoticed, but building a case that would hold up in court has required patience and careful documentation." As they walked through the aspen grove, Morrison continued his explanation. "Your testimony, Elena, combined with evidence we've been gathering, could finally provide the key to bringing down not just Barrow, but the entire network of corruption that has infected territorial law enforcement." "Why should we trust you?" Cale asked bluntly.
For all we know, you're working for Barrow yourself." Morrison stopped walking and turned to face them both. "Because," he said quietly, 3 years ago, my own daughter spoke out against corruption in a mining town in Colorado. She was found dead in her hotel room 2 days later, allegedly a suicide. The local sheriff ruled it an accident. The territorial authorities declined to investigate, and the man she had accused went on to steal another $1 million worth of silver claims before disappearing into Mexico. The pain in Morrison's voice was unmistakable, and Elena felt her suspicions beginning to dissolve. This was not the voice of a man working for corrupt interests, but of a father seeking justice for his child. "I'm sorry," she said softly. What was her name? Margaret. She was 23 years old, and believed that right would always triumph over wrong if good people just spoke up. Morrison's eyes grew distant with memory. She was wrong about that, of course, but she was right about everything else, and her death taught me that sometimes the law has to work around itself to achieve justice. They reached a cabin nestled among the aspens, its construction so skillfully integrated with the natural surroundings that it seemed to have grown from the earth itself. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Elena could smell coffee and bacon, cooking reminders of ordinary life that seemed almost surreal after their experiences in the deep places. "This is a safe house," Morrison explained as he led them inside. "One of several maintained by those of us who believe that true justice sometimes requires operating outside normal channels. You can rest here, recover from your ordeal, and decide what you want to do next." The cabin's interior was comfortable without being luxurious. Solid furniture, warm blankets, and shelves lined with books that spoke of a well-educated occupant. A woman emerged from the kitchen, elderly but spry, with kind eyes and capable hands. "This is Martha Goodwin," Morrison said. "She's been helping people in your situation for longer than either of us cares to remember." Martha studied Elena and Cale with the assessing gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating people quickly and accurately. "You've been through the trials," she said, and it wasn't a question. "I can see it in your eyes, both of you. The deep ones don't let just anyone pass through their realm." Elena exchanged glances with Cale, surprised but no longer shocked by the revelation that others knew of their underground journey. "How many people know about what we experienced down there?" "Not many," Martha replied, ladling stew into bowls and setting them on the table. "But there are some of us who remember the old stories, who know that there are powers in this land that predate white settlement by thousands of years, powers that sometimes choose to help those who fight for justice." Over the meal that followed, Morrison laid out the situation they faced with clinical precision. Marcus Barrow's crimes extended far beyond Dry Creek, encompassing fraudulent land deals, murdered claim holders, and corrupted officials across 3 territories. The federal investigation had identified him as the center of a web of corruption that reached into territorial capitals and even Washington itself. "The problem has been evidence," Morrison explained. "Barrow is careful, and his money has bought him silence from potential witnesses. But your testimony, Elena, combined with documents we've managed to acquire, could finally give us the case we need." "What documents?" Elena asked. Morrison reached into a leather satchel and produced a folder thick with papers. Financial records showing payments to various sheriffs and judges. Correspondence discussing the elimination of troublesome individuals. Even a confession of sorts, a letter Barrow wrote to his brother in Chicago, detailing some of his activities. Elena stared at the documents in amazement. "How did you get these?" "Let's just say that Barrow's security isn't as tight as he believes," Morrison replied with a slight smile, "and that there are people in his organization who have grown tired of being accessories to murder." Cale had been listening quietly, but now he leaned forward. "What about the bounty? As long as that reward stands, we'll have every gun for hire in the territories hunting us." Already taken care of, Morrison said. The bounty notice has been withdrawn, replaced with a federal warrant for Barrow himself. As of yesterday morning, he's the one being hunted. Elena felt a surge of satisfaction at the news, but it was tempered by caution. Even if we can bring him to trial, will it stick? He's bought judges before. Not federal judges, Morrison replied firmly. The case will be heard in Denver before Judge Harrison Cartwright. I've known Cartwright for 15 years. He's absolutely incorruptible and has a particular hatred for those who use violence to silence the innocent. Over the following days, Elena and Cale remained at the mountain refuge while Morrison prepared their case. Elena spent hours going over her testimony, recounting every detail of Barrow's crimes that she had witnessed or heard about. Cale contributed his own observations from the brief time he had spent watching Dry Creek before intervening to save Elena. But more important than the legal preparations were the personal conversations that took place during the long mountain evenings. For the first time since their flight began, Elena and Cale had the luxury of truly talking to each other. Not quick exchanges between pursuits or whispered conferences while hiding from enemies, but genuine conversation between two people learning to know each other. "Tell me about your childhood," Elena said one evening as they sat on the cabin's porch, watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. Cale was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes distant with memory. "It was good," he said finally. "My people lived as they had for generations, following the buffalo herds, making war on their enemies, raising their children to be strong and wise. I learned to ride before I could walk properly, to shoot a bow before I could read white man's words." "When did things change?" "When the soldiers came in greater numbers than the grass," Cale replied. "When the buffalo were slaughtered not for food, but to starve us into submission. When diseases we had no defense against swept through our camps like prairie fires." His voice grew heavy with old grief. "I watched my people dwindle from a proud nation to a handful of survivors huddled on a reservation, dependent on government handouts and forbidden to practice the customs that had sustained us for centuries." Elena reached out to take his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of a life spent handling weapons and working with horses. "How did you escape the reservation?" "I never went to one," Cale said simply. "When the last of my band agreed to surrender, I slipped away in the night. I've been living free ever since, keeping the old ways alive in whatever small ways I can." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain air. Finally, Elena spoke again. "I used to think that the law was enough," she said, "that if good people just worked within the system, justice would eventually prevail. David's death taught me otherwise, but I still believed that the solution was to expose corruption to higher authorities who would act on principle. And now," Elena considered the question carefully, "now I think that sometimes the law has to be helped along by people willing to take risks. The beings in the cave were right. We don't fight alone. There are others working for justice in their own ways, and sometimes we have to coordinate our efforts outside official channels." On the 5th day of their stay, Morrison returned with news that would change everything. He arrived at midday, his face grim with purpose, accompanied by 2 other men Elena didn't recognize. "It's time," he announced without preamble. "Barrow has been arrested and is being transported to Denver for trial, but there's been a complication." Elena felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of complication?" "Some of his men are planning to intercept the transport and free him," Morrison replied. "They're being led by Jake Morrison, no relation to me despite the name, and they've recruited help from as far away as Texas. We're talking about perhaps 20 men, all experienced gunfighters, all willing to kill anyone who gets in their way." Cale straightened in his chair. "When and where?" "Tomorrow morning at Red Rock Pass. The transport will be vulnerable there, steep terrain, On both sides, limited options for defense or escape. Morrison looked directly at Elena. "We need your help." "How can we help against 20 gunfighters?" Morrison smiled grimly. "Because you won't be facing 20. Federal marshals will handle most of them, but Jake Morrison and 2 others have a different target in mind. They plan to come after you personally to eliminate the key witness against their boss, even if they can't free Barrow himself." Elena felt ice form in her veins. "They know where we are." "Not yet, but they will. Someone in the federal marshal's office is feeding them information. We haven't identified who yet, but the leak is real." Morrison leaned forward. "We can't risk moving you to another safe house because the leak might compromise that location as well. Our only option is to set a trap of our own." "What kind of trap?" "We let Jake Morrison and his men find you, but on ground of our choosing and with support they won't expect." Morrison spread a map on the table. "There's a place about 10 miles from here called Devil's Canyon. It's perfect for an ambush, multiple escape routes for us, limited approaches for them, and terrain that favors defenders over attackers." Elena studied the map, her mind racing through possibilities and dangers. "How many men can you bring?" 4 federal marshals besides myself, plus some local allies who have their own reasons for wanting to see justice done. Morrison's expression grew serious. "I won't lie to you, this is dangerous. These men are professionals, and they'll be fighting with the desperation of people who know that failure means the gallows. What happens if we refuse? Then you spend the rest of your lives running," Morrison said bluntly. "Jake Morrison won't give up, and neither will the others who profit from the current system. This is your chance to end it once and for all." Elena looked at Kyle, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his dark eyes. They had come too far, sacrificed too much to spend their lives as fugitives. The time for running was over. "We'll do it," she said. The next morning found them positioned in Devil's Canyon, a narrow gorge with towering walls and a floor littered with boulders that provided excellent cover. Morrison had chosen the location well. There were only 2 ways into the canyon, both easily observed and defended, while multiple hidden paths led out through cracks in the walls. Elena crouched behind a massive stone, her rifle ready, but her hands surprisingly steady. The trials in the deep places had changed something fundamental in her relationship with violence. She still didn't like it, still hoped it could be avoided, but she no longer feared it with the paralyzing terror she had once felt. Kyle was positioned on the far side of the canyon, nearly invisible among the rocks and shadows. The other marshals were spread throughout the gorge, their positions carefully chosen to create overlapping fields of fire that would trap any attackers in a deadly crossfire. The waiting was the hardest part. Elena found her mind wandering to thoughts of the future, of what life might be like if they survived this final confrontation. She and Kyle had talked about finding a place where they could build something together, not just a home, but a life dedicated to the principles they had discovered in themselves during their trials. The sound of approaching horses ended her reverie. 3 riders appeared at the canyon's mouth, moving with the careful alertness of experienced fighters entering potentially hostile territory. Elena recognized Jake Morrison from his time in Dry Creek, a hard man with cold eyes and a reputation for violence that extended across multiple territories. "Elena Marlowe," Morrison called out, his voice echoing from the canyon walls. "I know you're in there. Come out peaceful-like, and maybe we can discuss this like civilized folks." Elena felt a moment of bitter amusement at the idea of civilized discussion with a man who had come to murder her, but she remained silent. The plan called for the attackers to enter the canyon fully before the trap was sprung. Morrison and his men urged their horses forward, their weapons drawn, but their attention focused on the rocks ahead rather than the walls above. They were experienced fighters, but they were also men accustomed to intimidating their opponents into submission. The possibility that their quarry might fight back with skill and determination didn't seem to have occurred to them. They had advanced perhaps 50 yards into the canyon when Morrison raised his hand, signaling a halt. Something in the quality of the silence had finally penetrated his confidence, warning him that all was not as it should be. "This feels wrong," Elena heard one of his companions mutter. "Everything about this job feels wrong," Morrison replied. "But the money's too good to walk away from. Spread out and search every rock. They're here somewhere." That was the signal Elena had been waiting for. Morrison's rifle cracked from the canyon wall above, and one of the gunfighters spun from his saddle with a cry of pain and surprise. Elena added her own shot a second later, aiming for the horses rather than the riders without mounts. The attackers would be trapped in the canyon. The battle was brief but intense. Jake Morrison and his men were indeed professionals, responding to the ambush with practiced efficiency. They took cover behind the available rocks and returned fire with deadly accuracy, forcing Elena to keep her head down as bullets whined off the stone around her position. But they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered, caught in a trap they hadn't anticipated by opponents who had every advantage of terrain and positioning. Within minutes, 2 of the 3 gunfighters were down, and Jake Morrison himself was pinned behind a boulder, with federal marshals closing in from both sides. "Give it up, Morrison," Marshal Morrison called out. "You're finished." "Like hell I am," came the angry reply, followed by a fusillade of shots that forced the lawmen back into cover. Elena saw movement in her peripheral vision and turned to see Jake Morrison attempting to work his way around to her position, using a jumble of rocks as concealment. He had apparently decided that if he couldn't escape, he would at least complete his primary mission of eliminating the key witness against his boss. She tracked his movement carefully, waiting for the right moment to take a shot. Morrison was good moving from cover to cover with the skill of long experience, but he was also desperate and therefore careless. When he raised his head to locate her position, Elena was ready. Her bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering across the rocks. But Morrison was tough, pulling his sidearm with his good hand and continuing to advance even as blood streamed down his arm. "You caused a lot of trouble, lady," he snarled as he closed the distance between them. "Time to pay the bill." Elena chambered another round, but before she could fire, Morrison staggered and dropped his weapon. Kyle stood behind him, having moved silently through the rocks to strike the gunfighter with the butt of his rifle. "It's over," Kyle said quietly, and Elena realized he was right. The canyon had fallen silent except for the groans of wounded men and the snorting of frightened horses. 2 hours later, they stood at the canyon's mouth, watching federal marshals load their prisoners into a wagon for transport to Denver. Jake Morrison was conscious but subdued, his shoulder bandaged and his hands shackled. The other surviving gunfighter sat beside him, nursing a bullet wound in his leg and contemplating the gallows that almost certainly awaited him. "That's the last of Barrow's organization," Marshal Morrison said with satisfaction. "With these men in custody and their testimonies added to the evidence we've already gathered, we'll be able to roll up the entire corruption network." Elena felt a profound sense of completion as she watched the wagon disappear down the mountain trail. The long flight that had begun with a whip raised over her back in Dry Creek's town square was finally over. Justice would be served not through vigilante violence, but through the legal system working as it was supposed to work. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you testify at Barrow's trial," Morrison replied. "After that, you're free to go wherever you want, do whatever you want. The federal government will be grateful for your service, and there will be opportunities if you're interested in continuing this kind of work." Elena looked at Kyle, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his dark eyes. "What kind of opportunities?" "The corruption we've exposed in the territories goes deeper than just Marcus Barrow," Morrison explained. "There are other towns, other criminals who think they can buy their way above the law. People like you, people who can't be bought or intimidated, are exactly what we need to root them out." The offer was tempting, Elena realized. The idea of continuing to fight for justice, of using the skills and knowledge she had gained during their ordeal to help others in similar situations, appealed to something deep in her soul. "We'll think about it," Cale said, speaking for both of them. As they walked back toward the cabin that had been their sanctuary, Elena found herself marveling at how much had changed since that morning in Dry Creek when she had stood before the whipping post. She was no longer the same woman who had spoken out in the Silver Dollar Saloon. That woman had been brave but naive, trusting in the power of truth alone to overcome corruption. The woman walking beside Cale Ironhorse through the mountain wilderness was someone different, tempered by hardship, tested by trials that went beyond the physical world, and bound to a partner who had proven his worth in the deepest places of the earth. 3 months later, Elena stood in a Denver courtroom, watching Marcus Barrow receive a sentence of 20 years in federal prison. The cattle baron who had terrorized 3 territories with his wealth and violence looked small and broken as the bailiffs led him away in chains. Outside the courthouse, she and Kyle were met by Marshal Morrison, who had additional news. "The territorial governor has asked me to extend an offer," he said. "There's a new town being established in Wyoming territory, and they need people with your particular skills to help establish law and order." Interested, Elena looked at Kyle, seeing the same spark of interest in his eyes that she felt in her own heart. They had found their calling in the fight for justice, and there would always be places that needed people willing to stand against corruption and violence. "When do we leave?" she asked. As their train pulled out of Denver Station the next morning, Elena watched the Colorado mountains fade into the distance and felt no sadness at leaving them behind. The mountains had given her and Kyle sanctuary when they needed it most, but they were not meant to hide from the world forever. They were meant to change it one corrupt town at a time, carrying with them the lessons learned in the deep places and the unshakable bond forged in the fires of shared trials. Whatever challenges awaited them in Wyoming territory, they would face them together, partners in justice, guardians of the innocent and living proof that courage and love could indeed outlast the harshest frontier. The train carried them westward toward their new life, while behind them the sun rose over a land where truth had finally triumphed over corruption and justice had proven stronger than gold. The Wyoming territory stretched before them like a promise written in grass and sky, endless rolling plains broken by distant mountains that rose like cathedral spires against the horizon. Elena pressed her face to the train window, watching the landscape change from Colorado's rugged peaks to the gentler but no less magnificent terrain that would become their new home. "Hard to believe we're doing this again," she said softly, her breath fogging the glass as the locomotive carried them toward an uncertain future. Kyle sat beside her, his dark eyes taking in the same vista with the practiced gaze of someone who could read stories in the land itself, where water might be found, which areas would provide good grazing, where enemies might hide or allies might be discovered. "Not again," he corrected gently. "For the first time, before we were running from something. Now we run toward something." The distinction mattered more than Elena had initially realized. In the months since Marcus Barrow's trial, she had come to understand that their desperate flight across the desert had been more than just an escape. It had been a transformation. The woman who had spoken out in Dry Creek Saloon had been motivated primarily by anger and grief. The woman now traveling to establish justice in a new frontier town was driven by something deeper and more sustainable hope. Their destination was a place called Redemption Creek, though Elena suspected the name had been chosen more for its symbolic value than any geographic accuracy. According to Marshal Morrison's briefing, the town had sprung up around a silver strike 6 months earlier, growing from a handful of prospectors and camp followers to a community of nearly 800 souls in the span of a single season. "Growing that fast, there'll be problems," Morrison had warned them during their final meeting in Denver, Claim jumpers, crooked gamblers, confidence men, and all the usual frontier parasites. But there'll also be good people trying to build something lasting. Your job is to help the good people succeed. The train's whistle echoed across the plains as they approached their stop, a tiny settlement that served as the jumping-off point for travelers heading to the mining camps scattered throughout the surrounding hills. Elena gathered their few possessions they had learned to travel light during their fugitive days, a habit that served them well in their new profession. As they stepped off the train into the crisp morning air, Elena was struck by the familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension that seemed to accompany every new beginning. The depot was little more than a wooden platform beside the tracks, but already she could see signs of the organized chaos that characterized Boomtown's freight wagons loading supplies, rough-dressed men heading off to distant claims, and the inevitable collection of entrepreneurs ready to separate newcomers from their money. "You, the folks from Denver?" The question came from a man approaching across the platform, his bearing suggesting authority despite his simple clothes. He was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair and the kind of steady eyes that Elena had learned to associate with natural leaders. "We are," Elena replied. "I'm Elena Marlowe, and this is Cale Ironhorse. You must be Mayor Patterson." "Tom Patterson, yes, though the mayor part is pretty informal. We haven't had time for proper elections yet." Patterson's handshake was firm, his manner welcoming but businesslike. "Marshal Morrison sent word that you were coming. We're grateful things have been getting complicated up in Redemption Creek." As they loaded their belongings into Patterson's wagon for the 20-mile journey to the mining town, Elena found herself studying their new employer with growing respect. Tom Patterson had the weathered look of a man who had spent his life working with his hands, but his vocabulary and manner of speaking suggested education and refinement. When she commented on this apparent contradiction, Patterson laughed. "Harvard Law School class of '52, he admitted. "Came west for my health after the war and discovered I liked building things more than arguing in courtrooms. But the legal training comes in handy when you're trying to establish civilization in places where the strongest man's word has been the only law." "What kind of complications are we walking into?" Kyle asked as their wagon began the winding climb into the foothills. Patterson's expression grew serious. "The usual ones, mostly. Disputed claims, men who think they can take what they want by force, business owners who see newcomers as sheep to be fleeced. But there's something else, something that has me more concerned than the ordinary frontier problems. Which is, there's been a pattern to the violence that suggests organization rather than random lawlessness. 3 claim holders have died under suspicious circumstances in the past month, and in each case their claims were immediately taken over by men connected to a single individual, a man named Carson Vale." Elena felt a familiar chill at the name. "Tell us about Vale." "He arrived in Redemption Creek about 2 months after the initial silver strike, supposedly just another prospector looking to make his fortune. But he had too much money, too many connections, and too many men willing to follow his orders without question. Within weeks, he had established himself as the unofficial power broker in town." "Sounds familiar," Elena said grimly. "Marshal Morrison thought you might say that," Patterson replied. "Vale's methods are similar to what you dealt with in Dry Creek, but more sophisticated. He doesn't openly defy the law, he corrupts it from within, buying officials and intimidating witnesses until his version of justice becomes the only version that matters." They crested a ridge that offered their first view of Redemption Creek, spread out in the valley below. Elena was impressed despite her concerns about the situation they were walking into. The town showed signs of genuine planning rather than the haphazard growth that characterized most mining camps. Streets had been laid out in a grid pattern. Buildings were being constructed with an eye toward permanence rather than temporary profit, and she could see the beginnings of civic infrastructure, a school, a church, even what appeared to be a small hospital. "Someone's been thinking ahead," she observed. "That would be my wife, Sarah," Patterson said, with obvious pride. She was a teacher back in Boston before we married, came west with me and decided that if we were going to live on the frontier, we might as well civilize it properly. The wagon rolled down into the town proper, and Elena found herself studying the faces of the people they passed. She had learned to read the character of communities in the expressions of their residents, and what she saw in Redemption Creek was encouraging. There was wariness, certainly, and the kind of tension that came from living with unresolved conflicts, but there was also hope, the look of people who believed they were building something worthwhile. Patterson's house stood on a quiet street near the center of town, a two-story frame structure that managed to be both comfortable and practical. Sarah Patterson proved to be a woman of middle years with intelligent eyes, and the kind of quiet strength that Elena had learned to recognize in other women who had chosen to make their lives on the frontier. "Welcome to Redemption Creek," Sarah said as she served them coffee and fresh bread in her kitchen. "I hope you'll forgive the simplicity of our accommodations. We're still establishing the niceties of civilization." "We've become accustomed to simple accommodations," Elena replied with a smile. "What can you tell us about the situation here? Your husband mentioned concerns about Carson Vale." Sarah's expression darkened. "Carson Vale is a cancer in this community. He presents himself as a respectable businessman, contributes to civic projects, even attends church regularly. But behind that facade, he's systematically destroying anyone who stands in his way." "What makes you so certain?" "Because I've seen it happen before," Sarah said quietly. "Tom and I lived in a mining town in California in the early days of the gold rush. The same pattern played out there, a powerful man using a combination of money and violence to establish control, always careful to maintain plausible deniability. By the time people realized what was happening, it was too late to stop him through legal means." Elena exchanged glances with Kyle, recognizing the parallels to their experience in Dry Creek. "What happened in California? The town died," Tom Patterson said simply. "Not physically, the buildings are still there, people still live and work there. But the spirit died, the sense of community and shared purpose that makes a place worth living in. People stopped trusting each other, stopped working together for common goals. They just put their heads down and tried to avoid attracting Vale's attention." "That won't happen here," Elena said with quiet conviction. "We won't let it happen." Over the following days, Elena and Cale began their investigation into Carson Vale's activities with the methodical patience they had learned during their ordeal in Colorado. They visited the sites of the suspicious deaths, interviewed witnesses, and gradually began to piece together the pattern of intimidation and corruption that was slowly strangling Redemption Creek's development. Vale himself proved to be a more sophisticated opponent than Marcus Barrow had been. Where Barrow had relied primarily on crude intimidation and violence, Vale used a combination of legal manipulation, economic pressure, and carefully calculated applications of force. He owned the largest general store in town, held mortgages on several important properties, and had financial interests in multiple mining claims. "He's building a web," Elena observed to Kyle as they reviewed their findings in the small office Tom Patterson had provided for their use. "Every business owner, every property holder, every person with something to lose finds themselves gradually becoming dependent on his goodwill. By the time they realize they're trapped, it's too late to resist." "There are still people willing to fight," Kyle pointed out. "The question is whether we can organize them before Vale eliminates them one by one." Their answer came sooner than expected, in the form of a young woman who appeared at their office door late one evening. She was perhaps 25 years old, with the calloused hands of someone who worked for a living and the kind of determined expression that Elena had learned to associate with people who had reached their breaking point. "My name is Martha Hendricks," she said without preamble. "I own the bakery on Main Street, and Carson Vale is trying to force me out of business. Tom Patterson said you might be able to help." Elena invited Martha to sit down and tell her story, which proved to be a familiar tale of economic warfare disguised as legitimate business competition. Vale had opened his own bakery directly across the street from Martha's staffed it, with experienced bakers hired away from other towns, and begun selling bread and pastries at prices that were clearly below his actual costs. "He's not trying to make a profit," Martha explained. "He's trying to drive me into bankruptcy so he can buy my shop and property for a fraction of what they're worth. When I went to the bank for a loan to tide me over, I was told that Mr. Vale had advised them I was a poor credit risk." "What about your customers?" Coyle asked. "Surely they prefer to support a local business owner over an outsider trying to manipulate the market." Martha's laugh was bitter. "Most of my customers also depend on Vale for other goods and services. He's made it clear that anyone who continues to patronize my bakery might find their credit at his store suddenly restricted or their supply orders mysteriously delayed." It was exactly the kind of systematic pressure Elena had expected, but experiencing it firsthand still filled her with anger. Vale was using his growing economic power to slowly strangle the independence of Redemption Creek's residents, forcing them to choose between their principles and their livelihoods. "We'll help you," Elena said, "but we'll need you to be brave. Fighting back against someone like Vale carries risks." "I've already lost everything that matters to me except my self-respect," Martha replied firmly. "I won't lose that too." Over the following weeks, Elena and Kyle began organizing resistance to Vale's growing influence. They started small, helping individual business owners find alternative suppliers and sources of credit that weren't controlled by Vale's network. They documented instances of intimidation and economic manipulation, building a legal case that could be used when the time came for more direct action. But they also prepared for the possibility that legal remedies might not be sufficient. Elena had learned during their trials in the deep places that justice sometimes required courage to act outside conventional channels, and she was prepared to take whatever steps might be necessary to protect the people of Redemption Creek. The confrontation, when it came, began with what appeared to be a routine business dispute. Martha Hendricks's bakery had finally succumbed to Vale's economic pressure, but instead of selling to him at his insulting offer, she had decided to liquidate her assets and leave town. Vale, apparently unwilling to accept even this partial defeat, had claimed that Martha owed him money for supplies purchased through his store and had obtained a court order to seize her remaining property. Elena and Kyle arrived at the bakery to find Vale's men loading Martha's equipment into wagons, while she stood helplessly watching her life's work disappear. The local constable was present ostensibly to ensure that the seizure was carried out legally, but his obvious discomfort suggested he knew the injustice of what was happening. "This is theft," Elena said quietly to the constable. "You know it, and everyone watching knows it." Constable William Hayes was a young man new to his position and clearly overwhelmed by the complexities of frontier law enforcement. "I have a court order," he said uncertainly. "I have to follow the law." "Whose law?" Cale asked. "The law as written or the law as interpreted by men who have been bought and paid for?" Before Hayes could answer, Carson Vale himself appeared dressed in an expensive suit that looked out of place in the dusty mining town. He was a man of average height but commanding presence with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of getting his way through a combination of money and intimidation. "Miss Marlowe," he said pleasantly, "I've heard a great deal about you. Your reputation precedes you, as they say." "I'm sure it does," Elena replied evenly, "just as yours does." Vale's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I trust you're not planning to interfere with a lawful seizure of property. That would be unfortunate." "I'm planning to see that justice is done," Elena said. "If that interferes with your plans, then perhaps your plans need to be reconsidered." The crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation stirred uneasily. Elena could feel the tension building, the sense that something significant was about to happen. This was the moment she and Kyle had been preparing for, the point at which subtle resistance would have to become open confrontation. "You're new here," Vale said, his tone still conversational, but with an underlying edge of menace. "Perhaps you don't understand how things work in Redemption Creek. This is a civilized community where disputes are resolved through proper legal channels, not through the kind of frontier vigilantism that might have been acceptable in less developed places." Elena felt a surge of anger at the casual dismissal of everything she and Kyle had endured to bring justice to corrupt frontier towns, but she also recognized the careful calculation behind Vale's words. He was trying to provoke her into some rash action that would justify harsher measures against the resistance they were trying to organize. "I understand perfectly how things work," Elena replied calmly. "The question is whether the people of Redemption Creek are willing to accept that system or whether they're ready to demand something better." She turned to address the crowd that had gathered around them. "Look at what's happening here. Martha Hendricks worked for 3 years to build a successful business that served this community. She employed local people, supported local suppliers, and contributed to the growth and prosperity of this town. Now she's being driven out of business not because she failed to serve her customers, but because her success threatens someone who believes he has the right to control every aspect of commerce in Redemption Creek." "She owes money," Vale interrupted. "Debts that must be paid according to law. Debts that mysteriously appeared only after she refused to sell her business to you," Elena shot back. "Debts documented on invoices that no one can verify for goods that no one remembers ordering. This isn't law, Mr. Vale. This is theft disguised as legal process." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Elena could see recognition dawning on several faces. These were intelligent people who had simply been too isolated and intimidated to see the pattern of manipulation that was slowly taking control of their community. "You're making serious accusations," Vale said, his pleasant demeanor finally beginning to crack. "I hope you're prepared to substantiate them." "I am," Elena replied, producing a folder of documents from her satchel. "Financial records showing the true ownership of the businesses you claim to have interests in. Testimony from suppliers who were pressured to refuse service to anyone who competed with your enterprises. Evidence of bribes paid to influence legal decisions in your favor." Vale's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. "Where did you get those documents?" Elena smiled. "From people who were tired of living in fear, people who were willing to risk your displeasure to see justice done. There are more of them than you might think, Mr. Vale." The crowd was openly stirring now, and Elena could see the first signs of the kind of righteous anger that could either build a community or destroy it. The key was to channel that anger constructively, rather than letting it explode into the kind of violence that would ultimately serve Vale's purposes. "I propose we settle this matter properly," she continued. "Let's convene a town meeting where these documents can be presented publicly and where the people of Redemption Creek can decide for themselves whether they want to continue living under Mr. Vale's version of law and order." Vale's composure finally cracked completely. "You have no authority here," he snarled. "You're nothing but a troublemaker who brings chaos wherever she goes." "I'm a citizen of this territory," Elena replied calmly, "and I have the same right as any other citizen to speak the truth and demand justice. The question is whether you're confident enough in your position to let the truth be heard." The challenge was delivered publicly in front of witnesses, in terms that made any refusal appear to be an admission of guilt. Vale was trapped by his own rhetoric about civilization and legal process. He couldn't refuse to participate in a democratic discussion without undermining the very legitimacy he had been claiming. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "A town meeting it is, but when your accusations are proven false, I expect a public apology and your immediate departure from this community. And when they're proven true, Elena replied, "I expect your immediate departure and full restitution to the people you've wronged." The town meeting was scheduled for the following evening to be held in the schoolhouse that Sarah Patterson had established as one of Redemption Creek's first civic institutions. Word spread quickly through the community, and Elena could sense the electricity of anticipation building as people contemplated the possibility that their problems might finally be addressed openly and honestly. But she also knew that Vale wouldn't simply accept defeat in a public forum. A man who had built his power through intimidation and violence wouldn't hesitate to use those tools when his more subtle methods failed. She and Kyle spent the day before the meeting preparing for every contingency they could imagine, including the very real possibility that Vale might try to eliminate them before they could present their evidence. The schoolhouse was packed beyond capacity when the meeting began, with people standing along the walls and crowding around the open windows to hear what was said inside. Elena had never addressed such a large and diverse crowd, but she found herself drawing strength from the memory of her trials in the deep places and the knowledge that she was fighting for something larger than personal survival. She began by presenting the evidence they had gathered systematically and methodically, allowing the documents to speak for themselves rather than relying on emotional appeals. The pattern of corruption and manipulation was clear once laid out in detail, and Elena could see recognition and anger building in the faces of her audience. Vale's response was predictable. He questioned the authenticity of the documents, suggested that Elena was an outside agitator with her own agenda, and tried to shift focus to the economic benefits his businesses had brought to the community. But his arguments rang hollow in the face of the evidence, and Elena could see that he was losing the battle for public opinion. That was when he made his final desperate play for control. Rising from his seat with theatrical anger, he pointed an accusing finger at Elena and delivered the kind of inflammatory speech designed to turn rational discussion into mob violence. "This woman is a known criminal," he declared. "She was involved in the murder of federal marshals in Colorado, and she's wanted by the territorial authorities for inciting rebellion against lawful government. Are we going to allow ourselves to be led astray by someone who has spent her life fighting against law and order?" The accusation was skillfully crafted, containing just enough truth to be believable while distorting the actual facts beyond recognition. Elena felt the mood in the room shift as uncertainty replaced the growing confidence she had been building. But before she could respond, Cale rose from behind his seat and began to speak in the clear, carrying voice of someone trained to address councils of warriors. "Carson Vale speaks of law and order," he said, "but he does not speak of justice. He tells you that Elena Marlowe is a criminal, but he does not tell you that she was condemned for speaking truth against a corrupt official who was murdering innocent people. He suggests that she fought against lawful government, but he does not mention that the government she fought against was one that had been purchased by men like himself." Kyle's presence commanded attention in a way that complemented Elena's more reasoned approach. Where she appealed to logic and evidence, he spoke to the deeper values that motivated people to risk comfort for principle. "I have known this woman through trials that tested not just her courage but her very soul," he continued. "I have seen her choose justice over safety, truth over profit, and the welfare of others over her own survival. If these qualities make her a criminal in Carson Vale's eyes, then perhaps we should ask ourselves what that tells us about Carson Vale's definition of law and order." The speech had its intended effect, reminding the audience of why they had gathered and refocusing their attention on the evidence Elena had presented. But Vale wasn't finished. Elena could see him signaling to men stationed around the room, men whose hands were moving toward concealed weapons. The attack, when it came, was swift and coordinated. Vale's hired guns drew their weapons simultaneously, creating chaos and confusion as people screamed and dove for cover. But Elena and Kyle had anticipated this possibility, and they were ready. Elena's first shot took out the lamp that lit the schoolhouse, plunging the room into darkness and making accurate shooting nearly impossible for attackers who didn't know the layout of the building. In the chaos that followed, she and Kale used their familiarity with the room's geography to position themselves advantageously while their opponents stumbled around in the darkness. The gunfight was brief but decisive. Within minutes, 3 of Vale's men were down and the rest had fled into the night. Vale himself was wounded but alive, cowering behind an overturned desk and calling for mercy from people he had spent months terrorizing. When Tom Patterson finally managed to relight the lamps, the scene that was revealed marked the end of one era in Redemption Creek's history and the beginning of another. Carson Vale's power had been broken not just by superior firepower, but by the willingness of the community to stand together against corruption and intimidation. "What happens now?" someone called out from the crowd. Elena looked around the room at the faces of people who had just witnessed their own liberation from fear and realized that her work in Redemption Creek was essentially complete. The community now had the tools and the confidence to govern itself according to principles of justice rather than the whims of whoever had the most money or guns. "Now you decide," she said simply. "You have the freedom to build the kind of community you want to live in. The question is what you'll do with that freedom." 3 weeks later, Elena and Kyle stood on the platform of Redemption Creek's small train station, their belongings packed and ready for another journey to another troubled community that needed their particular form of assistance. Carson Vale was in custody awaiting trial. His criminal organization had been dismantled, and the town was already showing signs of the prosperity that comes when people are free to work together for common goals. "Any regrets?" Kyle asked as they waited for their train. Elena considered the question, thinking about all they had accomplished and all they had learned about themselves in the process. "None," she said finally. "This is what we're meant to do. This is how we honor the gifts we were given in the deep places." The train whistle echoed across the valley as their locomotive approached, carrying them toward their next destination and their next opportunity to help good people build something worthy from the raw materials of hope and determination. As the train pulled away from Redemption Creek, Elena looked back at the town they were leaving behind and felt a deep satisfaction that transcended any personal achievement. They had helped create something that would outlast their presence, something that would continue to grow and prosper long after they were gone. That she realized was the true meaning of justice, not the punishment of the wicked, but the liberation of the good to pursue their highest aspirations without fear. And as long as there were communities struggling against corruption and intimidation, she and Kyle would be there to help, carrying with them the wisdom of the deep places and the unshakable bond forged in the fires of shared trial and triumph.